Japan's age of war was not born in a single battle, nor did it end with a single victory. It began with political paralysis, spread through unresolved feuds and broken successions, and consumed the country as authority collapsed from the center outward. This video traces the Sengoku Jidai in full, from the Ashikaga shogunate's slow disintegration and the fires of the Ōnin War, through a century of shifting alliances, betrayals, and brutal campaigns. We follow the rise of men who thrived in this chaos: Nobunaga's ruthless ambition, Hideyoshi's improbable ascent, and Ieyasu's patient consolidation of power. Each victory reshaped Japan, but none brought peace without blood. Only after decades of war would the fighting finally end, not with reconciliation, but with exhaustion and absolute rule. Welcome to our video on the Sengoku Jidai. Do you know why thousands of people on YouTube and Patreon support us financially? Because they get history you won't find anywhere else. We release 3 new exclusive videos every week. Plus, they get perks like early access to all videos, voting rights on upcoming series and videos, access to our private Discord, our production schedule, and much more. Right now, 250 exclusive episodes are waiting for members and patrons, including from our series on the Eastern Front of World War II, Spanish War of Succession, the Punic Wars, the Pacific War, the Iberian Reconquista, the Russian Revolution and Civil War, the North African and Italian campaigns of World War II, Sicilian Wars between the Greeks and Carthaginians, and many others. By joining, you're not only unlocking rare content, you're also supporting the stories you love. Your help allows us to keep producing 3 free videos per week while paying our team competitive salaries and growing the channel. Join via the links in the description, the pinned comment, or by pressing the join button under the video. Thanks for making this possible. In the 16th century, Japan was a united country only in theory. The shogun and the emperor's power had waned significantly, and the daimyo ruled the land. Hence the name Sengoku for the era, which took its name from the 100 States period of ancient China. While the process of land reunification began in the mid-16th century, mainly under Oda Nobunaga and his successors, Toyotomi Hideyoshi and Tokugawa Ieyasu, the splintering started in the latter half of the 15th century. Cracks in shogunate authority can be traced back further to the 14th century, when Emperor Go-Daigo attempted to restore imperial authority. Still, it was the 15th century that saw the decline of the Ashikaga clan and the weakening of the shogun's office. In 1443, the 10-year-old shogun Ashikaga Yoshikatsu had an accident where he fell off his horse and died. He was succeeded by his 7-year-old brother Yoshimasa, the man whom many historians would later blame for the country's collapse into civil war. Yoshimasa had a long reign of almost 50 years, but it wasn't a tranquil one. The southern court, the supporters of Emperor Go-Daigo who had risen against the Bakufu decades ago, had not been entirely defeated. Bad harvest years and natural disasters had caused famine, leading to peasant uprisings, and he also had to deal with the political machinations of powerful clans. So, while the causes of the Onin War are often boiled down to the Ashikaga succession crisis, the reality that led to this disastrous war was far more complex, involving other armed confrontations that weakened Ashikaga authority. One such conflict that Yoshimasa had with his predecessor, the 6th Ashikaga shogun Yoshinori, occurred in Kanto. In 1438, Yoshinori led his armies into Kanto to punish the Kubo of the area, Ashikaga Mochiuji, for going too far in another war, the Zenshu no Ran, a rebellion by the Uesugi and many other eastern clans against Mochiuji. Mochiuji was defeated in 1439 and forced to commit seppuku, while 2 of his sons also perished. So when Yoshimasa appointed Shigeuji, Yochiuji's last remaining son, to the position of Kanto Kubo in 1449, he had reasons not to trust the man entirely, so he appointed Uesugi Noritada as Kanrei to keep an eye on him. Shigeuji was already not on good terms with Noritada, for after all, the Uesugi had played a significant part in his father's demise. The conflict between the two men culminated in the murder of Noritada in 1454, which prompted the Uesugi to rise against Shigeuji and his allies. They captured and burned Kamakura, forcing Shigeuji to flee to Koga, from where he and his supporters continued the fight, even when Yoshimasa sent his brother Masatomo with an army to pacify the area and assume the office of Kubo. Unable to fully establish control over Kanto, Masatomo established his headquarters in Horigoe, and the two sides continued their struggle until 1482. Another clan conflict was the Hatakeyama Succession War, which occurred in 1454, under circumstances that would eerily resemble Yoshimasa's future. Hatakeyama Mochikuni, who had served as the shogun's deputy, had long been childless, so he had adopted his nephew Masunaga to be his heir. The problem was that in 1437 he had a son, Yoshinari, and before dying in 1455 he went back on his promise, making Yoshinari his heir, with Yoshimasa blessing the decision. However, Masunaga had powerful allies in Yamana Shozen and Hosokawa Katsumoto. The two Shugo persuaded Yoshimasa, who had initially sided with Yoshinari, to reaffirm Masunaga as the rightful successor. To make a long story short, Yoshimasa handled this case poorly, changing sides time and again, until in 1460 he definitively sided with Masunaga, permitting him to vanquish Yoshinari. Masunaga, with his forces, laid siege to Takayama Castle, where Yoshinari had sought refuge, but had underestimated the defenders' abilities, and the siege dragged on for years before Masunaga cut off their supply routes and forced Yoshinari to flee to Yoshino. Masunaga returned to Kyoto victorious as the head of the Hatakeyama. Yoshinari had lost the fight, but his staunch defense of Takayama and skill in military affairs had earned him an admirer. Yamana Shozen, impressed with the young man's abilities, extended a friendly hand. Shozen's changed stance towards Yoshinari was, without a doubt, born of his personal ambition to elevate the Yamana clan. While Hosokawa Katsumoto was his son-in-law, there was much rivalry between the two, and Shozen didn't hesitate to look for allies and premises to confront Katsumoto and weaken his position. Of course, the same can be said for Katsumoto. In 1458, he appointed Akamatsu Masanori as Shugo of Kaga province, weakening Shozen's position. And recently, another point of conflict had broken out between the two men, the Ashikaga succession dispute. When he first became shogun, Yoshimasa showed a genuine interest in state affairs, and was keen to restore the Bakufu to its former glory. However, the years of governance had taken a toll on him. The peasant uprisings, the failing economy, and the succession wars between the warrior families had exhausted him. For many years, like many of us, he desired to retire and enjoy life in his new personal villa, the Silver Pavilion, which he had already planned in 1460. However, Yoshimasa faced the same predicament Hatakeyama Mochikuni had, for in all those years he had failed to produce an heir. So in 1464, he persuaded his brother Ashikaga Yoshimi to abandon the monastic life he had chosen and become his deputy and heir. Yoshimi was reluctant at first to step into the pit of vipers, but after Yoshimasa reassured him that he would not shun him even if he had a son in the future, Yoshimi agreed. He also enjoyed Katsumoto's support, which was also a factor in convincing him to leave behind the Jodo monastery he had secluded himself in. For after all, Katsumoto was a robust and reliable figure in Japan's political landscape. All seemed well for roughly a year, until in 1465, Yoshimasa's wife, Hino Tomiko, gave birth to a son who would be named Yoshihisa. Talk about bad timing. And like every mum would do in her place, Tomoko would move mountains to make sure it would be her son, not Yoshimi, who would succeed Yoshimasa in the shogun's office. Since Yoshimi enjoyed Hosokawa Katsumoto's support, she naturally turned to the other powerful political pole of the capital, Yamana Shozen. Shozen, who saw this as another opportunity to elevate his position, threw his support behind Tomoko and her son. It was rather fitting, as Shozen was already turning his support for the Hatakeyama succession over to Yoshinari, thereby supporting the biological sons in both disputes, while Hosokawa was supporting the adopted sons and original heirs. Despite being arch-rivals, Shozen and Katsumoto worked together when the political circumstances suited both. Such was the situation over yet another clan succession crisis, this time of the Shiba family. In midsummer of 1466, Yoshimasa, on the behest of his aides, replaced Shiba Yoshikado as head of the clan and appointed Yoshitoshi. One of the men behind Yoshimasa's decision was Issei Sadachika, who was sort of like Yoshihisa's foster father. Roughly around that time, Sadachika, to promote Yoshihisa to the position of the shogun, also circulated a rumor that Yoshimi was planning a coup against Yoshimasa. This prompted Katsumoto to step in to protect Yoshimi. Shozen also intervened, as Shiba Yoshitoshi was in Sadachika's camp, and for Shozen, being related to the deposed Yoshikado meant he was an enemy of Yoshitoshi by proxy. In the end, Sadachika's rumors proved false, and he, along with Yoshitoshi and Akamatsu Masanori, was ousted from the capital. The year, however, was still hiding another big surprise for the residents of the capital. For in the last month of 1466, Hatakeyama Yoshinari, leading a large force, entered Kyoto and took residence at the Senbon Sakudo Temple. In the early days of the following year, Shozen convinced Yoshimasa to pardon Yoshinari, and the latter was invited to the shogun's palace without Yoshimasa first consulting Katsumoto or Masanaga, who at that time was acting as the shogun's deputy. As if to add further insult to the injury, Yoshimasa cancelled the traditional New Year's visit to his deputy and instead attended a banquet thrown in his honor by Yamana Shozen and reappointed Yoshinari as the head of the Hatakeyama, asking Masanaga to hand over his residence at Kasuga Marino-koji, as well as removing him from his position, which Shiba Yoshikado would later occupy. Naturally, Katsumoto could not stand idle and watch his political ally being reduced, so he planned on moving his troops to the shogun's palace and forcing him to declare Yoshinari a rebel. However, as we have already stated, Katsumoto's wife, fearing for her father, leaked this information to him. Thus, the Yamana side moved first, laid siege to the castle, and demanded the expulsion of Masanaga and Katsumoto. Yoshimasa didn't dare to make a move against Katsumoto, so he only permitted Yoshinari to attack Masanaga if necessary, on the condition that the other clans remain out of the Hatakeyama succession crisis. But Masanaga was not about to go down without a fight. So on the 18th of January, he set fire to his residence, and with his forces, he set up camp at the Kami-Goryo Shrine. There he welcomed Yoshinari's attack, who assaulted the temple complex with the support of Shiba Yoshikado, Asakura Takakage, and Yamana Masatoyo. The fighting was fierce and lasted until the night, when defeat became inevitable. Masanaga set fire to the shrine, and, using the flames as cover, escaped and sought refuge in Katsumoto's villa. An all-out war was now inevitable. Katsumoto called to his allies from across the land and brought troops from Hosokawa's territories to Kyoto, securing the city's major gates and burning several bridges. Under his orders, Akamatsu Masanori attacked Harima, the home province of the Yamana, and Bizen. From there, he then marched to Kyoto. In the meantime, Takeda Nobutaka fought Shozen's allies in Wakasa, the Ashiki clan, and Shiba Yoshitoshi invaded Totomi from Owari. After some time, Masanaga, having gathered some forces in Hokuriku, returned to the imperial capital. In Kyoto, troops from across the country were converging, reinforcing Katsumoto's and Shozen's forces, who would later be known as the Eastern and Western armies respectively. The city itself would become the battleground, and indeed, the capital had been split into spheres of control, with the lords fortifying their mansions and turning them into makeshift castles. In late June, Katsumoto made his move. Takeda Nobutaka and Hosokawa Shigeyuki attacked Ishiki Yoshinao's villa and burned it to the ground, with Yoshinao barely escaping. Katsumoto, on his part, took control of the shogunate's palace, because controlling the shogun meant he could enjoy political legitimacy. But the Western army did not stand passively either. Under Shiba Yoshikado, they launched an attack on Hosokawa Katsuhisa's residence. The defenders were reinforced from the east with forces led by Kyogoku Mochikiyo, but Yoshikado's men were able to rout them as well. The Western army pressed its advantage, burning Katsuhisa's mansion and attacking the villa of Hosokawa Shigeyuki. Only the timely intervention of Akamatsu Masanori's forces prevented total disaster, forcing the Western army back and allowing his allies to recover. Following this, both sides, exhausted from the battle, retreated. These attacks were not limited to the mansions of the lords. Temples, and generally any building complex that could house troops, were also attacked, and since fire was extensively used on both sides, neighboring buildings also fell victim to the conflict. A few days after the outbreak of the all-out war, Katsumoto was able to secure the shogun's banner and had Ashikaga Yoshimi appointed as commander-in-chief. With that, his troops now projected significant legitimacy to their cause, which could sway to his side many lords who stood on the fence. Bolstered by that, the eastern forces under Masanori fought and defeated Yamana Noriyuki at Ichijo-Omiya and then laid siege to Shiba Yoshikado's own residence. Demoralized by the shogun's stance on the conflict and the battlefield results, the western forces came close to surrendering, but the harsh conditions imposed by the eastern army destroyed any chance of peace. The fate of the Yamana camp looked bleak, but at the first light of the 23rd day of the 9th month, Yamana Shozen looked to the west, and there was Uechi Masahiro at the head of a large force, coming to his rescue. The Ōnin mentions 10,000 men, but as with the other regiments, this figure is likely a gross exaggeration. Still, his forces must have been considerable in strength, for the situation on the battlefield changed radically, and the Western army secured much of the city. A few days later, Hatakeyama Yoshinari and Asakura Takakage came under attack from Takeda's forces, but were able to repel the assault, and together with Rukaku Takayori and Ishiki Yoshinao, launched a counterattack at the Takeda base at Sanbuin Temple. Facing superior numbers and the fierce determination of the Western forces, the Takeda withdrew. After burning the temple complex, the Western troops marched and occupied the imperial palace without capturing the emperor, since the imperial family had long been transferred to the shogun's residence. Increasingly fearing for his safety, Ashikaga Yoshimi fled Kyoto, seeking refuge in Ise province. This was a blow to the Eastern Army's morale, which was already on the back foot. Even Akamatsu Masanori was unable to recover northern Kyoto, and defeated, he redeployed his forces in the eastern part of the city, at Higashi Iwakura. On the 16th of October, the Uchi attacked his position from the direction of the Nazenji Temple. Akamatsu's defenses were hastily constructed, and therefore shouldn't have been a serious obstacle. However, the attackers failed to coordinate their movements, and instead attacked each position in turn, allowing the defenders to move their troops and repel each assault. Despite their unexpected victory at Iwakura, the Eastern Army was still losing. On the last day of October, the forces of Hatakeyama Yoshinari and Asakura Takakage attacked those of Takeda Nobukado, who had set up their camp at Shokokuji. Before launching the attack, they bribed a temple complex monk to start a fire. A large and bloody fight between the two armies broke out amidst the inferno, with Yoshinari's men emerging victorious, but at a significant cost of their own as well. The site would change hands a few days later, when Hatakeyama Masanaga retook it by using a phalanx-like dense group of spearmen against Yoshinari's cavalry. Yoshinari countered by similarly using his own spearmen, ousting Masanaga's troops eventually, though the Western Army abandoned the burned temple complex since it offered no tactical advantage whatsoever. During the winter, there wasn't much movement, besides the occasional raid at each other's bases, which by that time had grown to be full-blown castles. But as the weather conditions became more favourable, action resumed. On the 13th of April, the Western forces attacked and destroyed some irregular troops of the Eastern Army under Honekawa Doken at Inariyama. In the following months, the Eastern military launched its own offensives, but they were not very successful. They were, however, successful on the political chessboard, as in the summer of 1468, Shiba Yoshikado had lost his position as Kanrei, after Yoshimasa became aware of a letter Yoshikado had sent to Ashikaga Shigeuji requesting reconciliation. In autumn, roughly a year after he had left the city, Yoshimi was persuaded by Katsumoto and Yoshimasa to return. However, a conflict soon arose between the two brothers when Yoshimasa refused Yoshimi's request to expel Hino Katsumitsu and then reinstated Issei Sadachika. The assassination of Yoshimi's close friend, Arima Motoie, was the straw that broke the camel's back, and so Yoshimi sided with the Western Army, which proclaimed him shogun. With the end of 1468, the war within the imperial capital died out. Fighting in the streets of Kyoto continued, of course, but it was not as intense and bloody as during the first 2 years. The conflict gradually moved to the provinces, as the two sides vied for supremacy in the 9 years of war that followed. Yoshimasa, facing the fact that his own brother had turned against him, was forced in 1469 to proclaim his son, Yoshihisa, as his heir. That same year, the Otomo and the Shoni clans attacked the Uchi's home province, but were defeated by Masanori's generals, so he remained with his forces in Kyoto. His presence in the capital proved a considerable factor in the course of the war, for he continued to fan the flames, even as Shozen and Katsumoto grew tired and sought a peaceful resolution. Not even their deaths in 1473 moved Masahiro to come to terms with Yoshimasa, and he entered a new round of skirmishes around the capital with Hatakeyama Masanaga. That same year, Yoshimasa officially abdicated in favor of Yoshihisa, but since the boy was only 8 years old, the retired shogun still held the real power. Masahiro continued his fight with Masanaga until the mid-autumn of 1476, when he agreed to enter negotiations with Yoshimasa. A year later, and almost to the day, Yoshinari took his army and left the capital to attack his hated rival Masanaga at Kawachi. He continued the fight throughout November until news reached him in the middle of December that Uchi Masahiro had agreed to Yoshimasa's generous terms and had evacuated his army from Kyoto. The Ōnin War was officially over. On that same day, Yoshimi, along with his eldest son, left Kyoto and headed to Mino province, where they were sheltered for a while by the Saito clan. Still, the two brothers would eventually reconcile, and Yoshimi, in later years, would return to Kyoto, and his son, Yoshitane, would become shogun in 1493. With the end of the war, Yoshimasa would finally be able to step down, seclude himself, and enjoy his retirement, which he so much craved. As for Yoshinari and Masanaga, they fought for decades, with the conflict between the two sides outlasting them and lasting until 1499. The war that had lasted for 9 years had not only destroyed the capital, but had brought the total collapse of the Ashikaga shogunate. From then on, the Ashikaga shoguns were essentially puppets of the Hosokawa clan, and later the Miyoshi, with conflicts arising between clans over who would control them. With the shogun and the shugo weakened, the road to the fragmentation of the land into quasi-independent states had opened, and soon warlords would carve their fiefdoms, defying shogunate authority. This process of fragmentation would last until the middle of the next century, when unification began, first with Oda Nobunaga, and later with his spiritual successors Toyotomi Hideyoshi and Tokugawa Ieyasu. Born in the early months of 1536, Hideyoshi was the son of a farmer named Yemon, who lived in a small village in the province of Owari near modern-day Nagoya. His father, in the spirit of the age, was also a part-time soldier, serving in the armies of the local warlord Oda Nobuhide. While Yemon's life as a foot soldier did put him in a better financial state compared to other peasants, he was, socially speaking, still far away from the ruling samurai class, and theoretically, his descendants couldn't hope to achieve much greater heights in life. In an age of constant warfare and bloodshed, being in the military was also extremely dangerous, and at the age of 7, Hideyoshi was orphaned. Not much else is known about his childhood, but we know that when young Hideyoshi turned 15, he sought to follow in his father's footsteps and become a soldier under the command of one of the retainers of Imagawa Yoshimoto. This was an odd maneuver, as the Imagawa clan was a rival of the Oda, the family his father had served diligently for years. But Hideyoshi had ambitions above his station, and Yoshimoto was one of the biggest names in Japan during that time. So powerful, in fact, that he was considered one of the few men capable of overthrowing the shogunate and assuming the title for himself. Hideyoshi's servitude under the Imagawa banner wouldn't last for long, and after 7 years, he sought employment from a young, ambitious, and ruthless warlord, Oda Nobunaga. This change of heart, as it turned out, couldn't have come at a more convenient time. Just 2 years later, in 1560, Imagawa Yoshimoto decided to march on the capital city of Kyoto and assume true power for himself by bending the Ashikaga shogun to his will. The road to Kyoto passed through the Oda domain, and the two sides would clash in a series of battles, with the largest and most pivotal being that at Okehazama. Ieyasu was born in Okazaki Castle of Mikawa Province on the 31st of January 1343, receiving the child name of Takechiyo. His father was Matsudaira Hirotada, the lord of Okazaki and daimyo of the province, and his mother was Odai no Kata, the daughter of Mizuno Tadamasa, who was lord of Karia Castle. Takechiyo was born in a difficult time for the Matsudaira clan. Mere months after his son's birth, Hirotada's uncle, Matsudaira Nobutaka, defected to the side of the Oda clan of Owari. At the same time, Tadamasa also passed away, leaving the leadership of the clan to his son Nobumoto, who also sided with Oda Nobuhide. Nobumoto was emboldened by the weakening of the Matsudaira clan and resumed his offensives in Mikawa. Hirotada, unable to directly confront the Matsudaira on the battlefield, sent Kagehi Shigetada to surrender Okazaki to Matsudaira Tadamoto. However, Shigetada's true mission was to assassinate the man, a dubious task which he successfully completed. An enraged Nobuhide gathered his troops to march to Okazaki and conquer Mikawa. Hirotada, lacking military strength, turned to Lord Imagawa Yoshimoto of Suruga province for assistance and offered Takechiyo as a hostage to the Imagawa. Young Takechiyo set off with a small escort of 50 armed men and 27 other companions and servants. Yet when nearing Tawara, they were ambushed by Toda Yasumitsu, who had turned to Nobuhide's side. Yasumitsu and his brother kidnapped Takechiyo and brought him in front of their master in Kowatari Castle. Using Takechiyo's life as leverage, the Oda Daimyo demanded that Hirotada surrender to Okazaki immediately. Hirotada was a warrior through and through, and determined that Takechiyo's death would serve only to solidify his alliance with the Imagawa. Thus, he refused. Upon seeing that Hirotada wouldn't bend, Nobuhide decided to keep Takechiyo hostage at Manshoji Temple in Nagoya. The boy stayed there for 3 years, but his captivity wasn't that bad. Because of his young age, everyone treated him with kindness, and he enjoyed far better conditions than any normal prisoner of war would expect. While Takechiyo was held hostage in Manshoji, the war between the two clans continued. With the assistance of the Imagawa forces, Hirotada was able to push back Nobuhide, but he wouldn't live long enough to enjoy his victory, as he died in 1549, likely of disease, although some suspected foul play. His rival Nobuhide also followed him to the grave at roughly the same time, leaving temporarily his eldest but illegitimate son, Nobuhiro, in charge of the clan. The Imagawa army, led by Yoshimoto's uncle, Sesai, besieged Nobuhiro's forces at Anjo. With Sesai's forces threatening to conquer the province completely, Nobunaga agreed to end the conflict and save his trapped half-brother by releasing Takechiyo. The 9-year-old boy was then transferred to Sumpu after a brief stay in Okazaki, where he paid his respects to his father's grave. Takechiyo's time in the Imagawa capital was similar to what one would expect of a lord of his age, minus the freedom to travel as he pleased. Wanting to foster a loyal and dependable ally, Yoshimoto provided everything young Takechiyo could possibly need. Naturally, the boy was not alone in Suruga, as 2 guardians and 7 pages, roughly his own age, accompanied him. These men would later stand by an adult Tokugawa Ieyasu's side, and included individuals such as Sakakibara Sadamasa, Abe Mototsugu, and the man who would become his closest friend in life, Tori Mototada. In Suruga, there was also another noble boy with whom Takechiyo developed a close relationship. Takechiyo spent much of these blissful childhood years ignoring Sesai's tutelage in favor of his favorite pastime activity, hawking, but these idyllic days would soon come to an end. When Takechiyo reached the age of 15, a coming-of-age ceremony was held at Sumpu, with Yoshimoto himself becoming the Eboshoya, something similar to his godfather. The Imagawa daimyo also gave Takechiyo a new name. He would, from then on, be known as Matsudaira Jirosaburo Motonobu. He did not keep that name for long, and the following year he married Yoshimoto's niece and changed it to Motoyasu after his grandfather Kiyoyasu, whom he admired. The following spring, Motoyasu finally went on his first campaign, seeking to recover the lands of West Mikawa, which had come under Nobunaga's control after the betrayal of Suzuki Shigeteru. After gathering his men in Ozaki, Motoyasu moved towards Terabe and was able to capture some of the outlying fortifications. However, the main castle proved a tough nut to crack, so the Matsudaira daimyo was content with setting the fortress on fire and retiring safely. A counterattack launched by Oda forces was easily repelled. Motoyasu returned triumphantly to Sumpu and Yoshimoto, who granted him gifts, but did not allow him to relocate to Okazaki permanently. This didn't affect Motoyasu, who continued adding military successes to his resume. The next year, he was tasked with resupplying the castle of Otaka, which had come under siege from forces loyal to the Oda. The castle had been built as an outlying fortress by Nobunaga, and had recently come under Imagawa control after its castellan had defected to Yoshimoto's side. Naturally, Nobunaga was determined to reclaim Otaka, and his forces held a tight grip on the castle. Not only that, but 4 other Oda-controlled castles, Ueshizu, Manue, Umezu, and Terabe, were in close proximity and blocked the approach. As they were approaching the area, Motoyasu ordered around 1,000 of his men to attack the forts of Terabe and Umezu during the night to create a diversion. Motoyasu himself led the second contingent, which numbered roughly 800 strong, stayed with the provisions train and hid around a mile from Otaka. The diversionary assault worked miracles, as the attackers were able to penetrate the defenses of the 2 castles and drew the garrisons of the other 2, who, having heard the great commotion, came to the assistance of their comrades. With the Oda forces occupied elsewhere, Motoyasu led the provisions train safely into Osaka. Having established himself in the eyes of Yoshimoto as a competent commander, Motoyasu was ordered to continue his military operations for the rest of the year, and of course was included in Yoshimoto's greatest operation in July of the following year. Yoshimoto and the Imagawa clan were descended from the Minamoto clan and had close blood ties with the ruling Ashikaga shoguns. Having witnessed the decline of the Ashikaga for many years, Yoshimoto had prepared to march into Kyoto and perhaps claim the title of shogun for himself. After all, his lineage would permit him to do so. In 1560, Yoshimoto was one of the few daimyos in Japan who commanded a strong enough force that was close enough to the capital to have a shot at seizing the ultimate prize. In the summer, he made his move, following the Tokaido Road through Mikawa at the head of a large force, which some sources estimate to have been around 40,000 men, while others put that number to around 25,000. Naturally, Motoyasu and his hardened Mikawa samurai were part of this force when Yoshimoto moved into Owari and began reducing the Oda border castles. Motoyasu's regiment managed to capture and then destroy Marune, and for this deed, the Imagawa daimyo gave him command of Otaka and allowed him to recuperate there. Meanwhile, Yoshimoto's own men had captured Ueshizu and had set up camp near Okehazama, where they were celebrating their success. But while Yoshimoto, full of himself, was celebrating an early victory, the Oda troops, vastly more familiar with the land, moved around Nakajima Castle and by a route that passed through the rice fields, managed to pass undetected to the Imagawa forces' rear. According to the legend that surrounds the battle, the Oda troops assaulted the Imagawa camp, charging down from a hill while a thunderstorm was raging on, masking their movements. Yoshimoto's men, caught completely by surprise, offered little resistance. If Hideyoshi fought in the battle, then he must have been amidst the bloodshed that ensued, as Oda Ashigaru and samurai slaughtered their enemies, including the Imagawa daimyo. At that point, the morale of the invading Imagawa forces completely collapsed, and they were routed from the battlefield, heading back to their home province of Suruga. Before long, news of Yoshimoto's death reached Motoyasu. After confirming the validity of this death and realizing that Nobunaga could now strike in his direction, Motoyasu cautiously retreated to Mikawa. Without the Imagawa daimyo to obstruct him, he moved into Okazaki after the Imagawa troops abandoned it. From there, he launched a small incursion into Owari to put the Oda forces in check, but took no further action. Nobunaga made no move towards Mikawa at that time, but in the following year, he extended his hand to Motoyasu to form an alliance. Motoyasu was caught between a rock and a hard place. Yoshimoto's heir, Ujizane, was an aesthete, having inherited his father's obsession with the arts. Yoshimoto was not a great warrior, and Ujizane was even less so. It was therefore evident to Motoyasu that Ujizane was not the man to rely on during such dangerous times. On the other hand, the Imagawa still held many hostages of the Matsudaira clan, and had been a long-standing ally. After much deliberation, Motoyasu decided to throw in his lot with the Oda and travelled to Kiyosu to solidify his new alliance. Naturally, this move alarmed Ujizane, who questioned Motoyasu's intention. Still, he was able to convince him that his journey to Owari only served to placate the Oda daimyo and buy some time of respite for both the Matsudaira and the Imagawa clans. As Ujizane still held Motoyasu's wife and firstborn son as hostages, the Matsudaira daimyo could not yet openly side with the Oda or go against the Imagawa. But in 1562, he came up with a plan to overcome this obstacle. He sent 80 men to infiltrate Kaminogo Castle in the southern part of Mikawa, which also marked the westernmost point of Imagawa's border. Posing as Imagawa soldiers, they entered the castle. Once inside, the group of shinobi managed to cause great commotion by setting fire to buildings and killing Udono Nagateru, who was Kaminogo's commander and Ujizane's cousin, and capturing his sons. Ujizane agreed to exchange Motoyasu's wife and children for them, but in reprisal, he executed some of the hostages that hadn't been included in the deal. Among these was Motoyasu's father-in-law, who was forced to commit seppuku. Motoyasu would go on to solidify his alliance with Nobunaga by marrying his firstborn son, who assumed the name Nobuyasu, to Nobunaga's daughter, Toku. The new name, as you might have already guessed, served to flatter the Oda warlord, who was the senior partner in this alliance. Speaking of name changes, Motoyasu would change his name once again, shedding the prefix Moto, which he had taken in honor of his master Yoshimoto. From 1563 onwards, he would be known as Ieyasu, the prefix Ie in honor of the previous shoguns who had it in their name, and especially Minamoto no Yoshi-Ie, a legendary samurai of the Heian period, whom Ieyasu regarded highly. Imagawa Ujizane was not a man suited for war, but before Ieyasu could make a move against him, he would first need to secure his rule on Mikawa. Like in many other regions in Japan during that time, religious sects had gathered significant power and threatened the established order in Ieyasu's home province. Some of these sects, known as the Ikki, had even declared their autonomy, collecting their own taxes and raising their own forces. To make matters worse for Ieyasu, they even controlled forts close to Okazaki, becoming the master of the roads and communications to and from his seat. Moreover, in late 1563, when Ieyasu demanded a part of the rice stockpiles in Jogaji Temple, an armed uprising erupted. The armed peasants and warrior monks were even joined by some of Ieyasu's retainers, who held a grudge against him for the slaughter of the hostages in Simpu, or were with the rebels out of religious sympathy. Others joined Ieyasu's enemies simply because they thought the crisis provided a good opportunity for them to obtain greater power. However, the majority of Ieyasu's men remained loyal to their master and helped him put down the uprising. On the 15th of January of the following year, the two sides clashed at the battle that would largely determine the outcome of the uprising. Forces from the Honshu-ji and Shoman-ji temples marched to capture Okazaki, knowing that Ieyasu was absent. Indeed, Ieyasu had left 2 days earlier to defend Kamiwada Fortress, where a bullet came close to ending his life. The remaining troops engaged the rebels at Ohira. When news of the battle reached Ieyasu's ears, he rushed with his uncle, Mizuno Nobumoto, to attack the Ikki's rear and engage them at Akukizaka. Leading heroically from the front line, Ieyasu inspired his troops, and even managed to win back some of those who had previously defected to the Ikkō-ikki. The victory at Akukizaka, while it did not bring an immediate end to the Ikki uprising, significantly weakened the religious sects and convinced many of the rebels to return to Ieyasu. By mid-February, the forces of the Mikawa Ikkō-ikki had weakened so much that they offered peace terms to Ieyasu. The rebels asked for pardons for the lives of the participants and the leaders, and for the temple grounds to be kept as they were before. Ieyasu, whose top priority at that time was to bring order to Mikawa, quickly agreed, and peace returned to the land. Ieyasu did indeed spare the lives of those who had rebelled against him, and he even forgave some of them, but not all of them went unpunished. A number of them, including Masanobu, had their lands and titles stripped away and were forced into exile. A few months later, as the influence of the temples had weakened even more, Ieyasu went back on his promise and ordered the temples to be demolished. When the monks tried to complain, Ieyasu explained that he thought keeping the grounds as they were before meant before the temples were constructed, and therefore he was returning the land to nature. With no armies left to oppose him, the monks simply accepted their fate. The battle at Okehazama shook the political landscape of central Honshu. Still, in the following year, a battle of equal fame took place in the Japanese Alps at Kawanakajima between the Takeda and the Uesugi clans. The residents of the area had become accustomed to the two clans fighting there, as they had clashed 3 times already, with the most recent battle having occurred just 4 years earlier. This time, their conflict had its origins in Uesugi Kenshin's campaign against the Hojo in the spring of 1561. Gathering a massive host, Kenshin marched into Kanto and even laid siege to Odawara, the home castle of the Hojo. Honoring his alliance with the Hojo and knowing he couldn't just let Kenshin acquire that much power, Shingen took to the field and, in May, crossed the Usui Pass and headed into northern Shimano. There they descended to Warigadake Castle near the shore of Lake Noriji, forcing Kenshin to return to Echigo and march his forces to Kawanakajima to prevent any further incursions. Leaving behind Saito Tomonobu to defend Echu and Nagao Masakage at Kasugiyama, Uesugi Kenshin, at the head of more than 18,000 men, approached the Takeda forces' position, leaving some 5,000 at Senkoji as a rearguard. The border, if we can call it that, between the two clans had been fortified by the Takeda, who had captured and constructed castles behind Chikumegawa, with the most important one being that of Kaizu, located in a strategic position that would enable the Takeda to control the battlefield. Realizing the defensive capabilities of Kaizu, Kenshin headed to the fort of Aminomiya, where another river crossing existed, and captured nearby Saijo Hill, threatening the Takeda left flank. There he waited. In the meantime, Shingen, who was in Kofu, had received a message of Kenshin's moves and marched out at the head of an 18,000-strong force, reaching Kawanakajima on the 3rd day of October. There he set up his own camp on the west bank of Chikumogawa on a hill called Chausuyama. For 5 days, nothing happened, as both commanders had realized their armies were evenly matched. However, on the 8th, Shingen broke camp and headed into Kaizu, where he convened a council to devise a battle plan. There, his right-hand man and military advisor, Yamamoto Kansuke, proposed luring Kenshin's army into an attack and into a position where they could be flanked. The plan was as follows. Shingen would take 8,000 men and, using the cover of night, would move and take positions at Hachimanbara, the center plains of Kawanakajima, by way of Hirose Fort. Once that was done, Kosaka Masanobu would take the rest of the army, some 12,000 men, and again, using the cover of darkness, would attack Kenshin's position at Saijo-san from the rear. Thus, Masanobu's attack would force the Uesugi down the mountain and into Shingen's regiment. Facing an attack from both sides, Kenshin would surely be defeated. Following Kansuke's plan, Shingen marched his group to Hachimanbara, where he deployed his forces in a stork's wing formation. Yamagata Masakage, Takeda Nobushige, and Naito Masatoyo took the center of the vanguard, Morozumi Masakiyo on the right wing, and Anayama Nobukimi the left. Behind them followed the main body of Shingen's group, with Takeda Nobukado and Hara Masatane on the left, and Mochizuki Masayori and Takeda Yoshinobu on the right. Even further behind was the rearguard, commanded by Atobe Katsusuke, Imafuku Zenkuro, and Asari Nobutane. From Shingen's perspective, all had gone according to the plan. However, Kenshin had not been fooled. His spies and scouts had informed him of Shingen's movements, and the Dragon of Echigo had marched most of his troops during the night away from Saijo-san, leaving behind only a force of 1,000 men to guard the fort of Amennomiya, and took positions in front of Shingen's force. As dawn broke, Kenshin unleashed his attack on the Takeda position, catching Shingen, who was expecting the Uesugi troops to be fleeing from Masanobu's attack, completely by surprise. The leading charge of the Uesugi troops met those of Takeda Nobushige, and a fierce battle ensued that claimed the life of Shingen's brother. On the right flank, Takemata Hiratsuna launched his attack on Naito Masatoyo and Morozumi Masakiyo. When his troops showed signs of fatigue, Kenshin replaced them with fresh troops, maintaining the pressure on the Takeda forces and creating what has been described as a winding wheel. From his headquarters at the center, Shingen was desperately trying to manage the situation that was turning for the worse as even his center was being pushed back. Then, in the midst of combat, one of the most famous duels of the Sengoku Jidai took place. A mounted figure came galloping towards Shingen, who was sitting on his stool. The white head cowl and his green surcoat betrayed his identity. It was Uesugi Kenshin himself. The dragon had found the tiger, and was trying to end the conflict with a single stroke of his sword. Having no time to draw his, Shingen parried the blows with his war fan, before his retainers intervened and drove off Kenshin. The fierce fight continued, claiming also the lives of Morozumi Masakiyo and Yamamoto Kansuke, who considered themselves responsible for the plan's failure, and charged the Uesugi lines alone, perishing in a blaze of glory. But despite the numerous losses, the Takeda force stood firm, and Shingen had a hidden ace up his sleeve, Kosaka Masanobu's regiment, which by that time had climbed up the desolate Saijo-san and realized what had happened. Wasting little time, Masanobu led his troops down the mountain towards Amennomiya, and from there they would attack Kenshin's flank. The fort at Amennomiya was guarded by Amakasu Kagemochi and his 1,000-strong regiment. Despite their fierce resistance, Masanobu's force was 12 times larger, and soon crossed the river onto the plains and fell on Kenshin's flank. Short of how the original plan was supposed to unfold. The battle continued for a few hours, until both sides stopped to lick their wounds. Masanobu had saved Shingen from a defeat, but the outcome of the Fourth Battle of Kawanakajima could hardly be called a victory for either side, though both did claim it as such. Both clans had lost many soldiers and notable generals, making the battle one of the most costly draws in their history. The following day, Kenshin destroyed whatever remained of his camp at Saijo-san, and retreated towards the north. Shingen did not stop him. Following the spectacular victory at Okehazama, Nobunaga consolidated his power in Owari and began a long and bloody campaign to subjugate the neighboring Mino province ruled by the Saito clan. During this time, and through his brilliant achievements, Hideyoshi would rise to fame, and become one of Nobunaga's most trusted advisors and generals. Nobunaga's preference towards Hideyoshi can be seen by his appointment as a sandal bearer, whose duty, as the name implies, was to carry his lord's sandals and keep them warm. This was considered a prestigious position, as Hideyoshi would accompany his lord everywhere. But warming footwear wasn't the only item on Hideyoshi's to-do list. He would also take on and succeed in every task that was delegated to him, such as the reconstruction of Kyushu Castle. But where Hideyoshi truly shined was military affairs. Saito's main stronghold, Inobiyama Castle, was a formidable mountain fortress, and because of the geography of the region, the most effective approach was from Tsunemata. According to legends, Hideyoshi proposed the construction of a fortification there, a task he would undertake and, with the help of a bandit named Hachisuka Masakatsu, complete overnight. This apocryphal tale clearly exaggerates Hideyoshi's siegecraft ability, which was nonetheless astonishing. Even with using pre-constructed parts, the fortifications at Tsunemata would take several days to be constructed, and when finished, they would be a far cry from the traditional Japanese castle that comes to mind, instead resembling more of a fort, with moats, wooden palisades and watchtowers, a sight that, despite its humble looks, caused some panic among the Saito retainers. Another tale of the time tells us of how Hideyoshi was able to enlist under his service the master tactician Takenaka Shigeharu, also known as Hanbei. The most likely fictitious account states that Hideyoshi visited the renowned strategist who lived in solitude on Mount Kurihara and successfully convinced him to join the Oda camp after meeting him 3 times, an act reminiscent of Zhuge Liang's recruitment by Liu Bei in Romance of the Three Kingdoms. Finally, it was time for the final assault at Inobiyama, and Hideyoshi's contribution to the capture of Inobiyama had him leading a literal commando raid inside the castle. As a frontal assault on the impregnable Saito stronghold was deemed suicidal, alternatives, including bribery, were explored. But Hideyoshi, in his usual outgoing and likable fashion, had befriended the son of a local farmer named Horio after seeing him wrestling with a boar. Horio revealed to Hideyoshi the existence of a goat path leading up the cliffside of the mountain to the north of the castle, and in turn, Hideyoshi told his lord of his plan to lead a select group of men into the fortress to open the gates for Nobunaga's main force from the inside. Nobunaga gave his permission, and during the night, guided by Horio and using only the moonlight to see, Hideyoshi's men scaled the cliff and entered Inobiyama unnoticed. Just before dawn, the brave commandos came out of their hiding spots and began causing havoc by lighting fires which spread panic among the castle's garrison. Hideyoshi and his men then climbed the walls and tied the gourds they used as water canteens on the tip of their spears to signal Nobunaga that the plan was a success. Oda's main force soon swept up the mountain and promptly captured Inobiyama, which became Nobunaga's new main seat of power and was renamed Gifu. To celebrate and remember this great victory, Hideyoshi adopted the gourd as his battle standard, and popular tales often tell that for each victory gained, he would add another one, thus famously creating the 1,000 golden gourd standard. In the previous episode, we followed Ieyasu's early life until his consolidation of control over Mikawa province and his alliance with Oda Nobunaga. While Nobunaga was definitely the rising star of Japan at this time and capable of exerting more influence, Ieyasu was not lacking in ambition. Having secured Mikawa for the Matsudaira clan, his gaze turned towards the lands of Totomi and Suruga, which were still ruled by his former overlords, the Imagawa. Before moving on with the invasion of Totomi and Suruga, let us first talk a bit about yet another name change for Ieyasu, and thankfully the last one. In 1567, Ieyasu was able to obtain a permit from the emperor to change his last name to Tokugawa, claiming descent from the Seiwa Genji via a branch of the Nita clan. Initially, the imperial court had refused to grant him this right, as there had been no evidence of such pedigree in the Matsudaira clan. However, Ieyasu was able to find, or rather construct, a genealogical document proving his lineage. Thus, he was permitted to adopt the last name of Tokugawa. He was also appointed as Mikawa no Kami, Lord of Mikawa, and received the junior 5th rank in court. This might seem of little significance at first, but for a man as ambitious as Tokugawa, having the right pedigree was paramount, for only those descended from the Seiwa Genji and related to the Minamoto clan could claim the title of shogun. Perhaps Ieyasu was planning too far ahead, but history proved him right in the end, so who are we to judge him? As we established previously, Imagawa Yoshimoto was not a great military leader, and since the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, his son Ujizane was equally incapable, if not worse. Despite that, the Imagawa still wielded considerable strength, and were allied to some of the most powerful clans of Japan, the Hojo of Segami Province and the Takeda of Kai. The latter was by far the biggest threat. The Takeda cavalry had no equal in the land of the rising sun. Their daimyo, known as Takeda Harinobu, or alternatively by his Buddhist name of Shingen, was considered one of, if not the greatest military strategist at the time, his only equal being his great rival Uesugi Kenshin. It is therefore understandable that Ieyasu could not blindly move against the Imagawa, not unless something would disturb the balance of power. Luckily for him, Shingen was more than eager to accelerate the fall of the declining Imagawa clan and claim their lands for his own. Such a move against a decades-old ally was not easily accepted by everyone. For one thing, his eldest, albeit illegitimate son, Yoshinobu, was married to Ujizane's sister and naturally objected to his father going to war with his father-in-law. For the sake of his wife, Yoshinobu rebelled against his father, only for Harinobu to defeat him, capture him, and execute him. Along with Yoshinobu, one of Shingen's most trusted advisors, known as 24 Generals Obu Toramasa, was also forced to commit seppuku for the same reason. With their deaths, the Takeda camp was now unified behind their daimyo's will. Shingen had already established an alliance with the Oda by marrying his daughter Matsuhime to Nobunaga's son and heir Nobutada. Though the marriage was never consummated, it secured the alliance between the two clans, at least for the time being. Shingen then extended this pact to Ieyasu, suggesting they attack Ujizane together and split up the Imagawa lands between themselves. Totomi province would go to the Tokugawa and Suruga to the Takeda. Ieyasu accepted, probably thinking that in the future he would have to face Shingen either way, so he might as well benefit from them for now. The war with the Imagawa was easier than one would have expected. Facing the much stronger Takeda forces, Ujizane's troops only temporarily managed to put a stop to the invaders at Sata Mountain Pass, while others who had secretly switched sides preferred flight to fight. Seeing how hopeless his position was, Ujizane also decided to flee Suruga and sought refuge in Kakegawa Castle in Totomi. The news of their lord's retreat to Totomi disheartened the remaining Imagawa soldiers, and the entire line collapsed, leaving the road to Sumpu open. Led by Baba Nobuharu, the Takeda forces marched to the capital of the Imagawa and put it to the torch, despite Shingen's desire to take Ujizane's villa untouched on account of the many treasures the Imagawa had collected over the ages. However, while the Imagawa had offered little resistance, Shingen's actions aggravated the third party of the alliance, Hojo Ieyasu, who dispatched his son Ujimasa to march on Suruga during the first days of 1569 at the head of 45,000 men. In response, the Takeda fortified the Sata Pass, just as the Imagawa had done before, blocking the Hojo advance. Shingen's men were already facing a shortage of military provisions, and their situation worsened when they launched a failed attack against Imagawa's Omiya Castle that controlled the Nakamichi and Suruga roads. By March, their lack of supplies forced Shingen to pull back the majority of his troops to Kai through the much harder Taru Pass, with Ujimasa also retreating back to Sagami. While this was happening at Suruga, Ieyasu had invaded Totomi from Mikawa by way of Jinza Pass. He quickly captured Futamata and Hikima castles and laid siege to Kakegawa Castle, where Ujizane had barricaded himself. Kakegawa's defenders had also been reinforced by Hojo troops that had arrived by sea, while some other Imagawa-owned castles lay at its periphery, namely Horie, Utsuyama and Horikawa. Ieyasu settled down for a long siege and built up his own defenses around Kakegawa. But the Imagawa forces did not sit idle, launching numerous attacks and at times forcing the Tokugawa forces to retreat. Nevertheless, the castle was eventually surrounded. While Shingen's position gradually worsened as his army was bogged down by Ujimasa's army and loyal Imagawa forces had recaptured Sunpu, Ieyasu was enjoying some success, capturing the castles of Utsuyama, Horikawa and Horie in March. Following this, Ieyasu entered negotiations with Ujizane, promising to help him regain Suruga if he gave Totomi to him. Ujizane accepted, and Kakegawa Castle was delivered to the Tokugawa on the 6th of May. Not long after, Ieyasu ended his alliance with Shingen and entered into one with Uesugi Kenshin. Ujizane fled to Hojo-controlled Izu, and to flip the finger to both Shingen and Ieyasu, there he wrote a letter proclaiming that he was transferring lordship of both Suruga and Totomi to Hojo Ujimasa's eldest son, Ujinao, who at that time was still a small child. Of course, this mattered little, as Ieyasu was firmly in control of Totomi, and Shingen was not going to give up on conquering Suruga. In June, Ujimasa and Uesugi Kenshin formalized an alliance against the Takeda, an event that did nothing to stop Shingen from coming down from Kai that very same month. He first invaded Hojo lands, devastating part of Mishima and Izu, before turning westwards to invade Suruga a second time and tie up loose ends. His third attack on Omiya Castle the following month proved fruitful, and Fuji County fell under Takeda control. From there, the Tiger of Kai had his troops retreat to Kofu, and after securing a peace treaty with the Uesugi, he attacked the Hojo lands in Musashi by way of Shinano province. This wasn't an honest invasion to wrestle control of Kanto from the Hojo, but a diversion to draw Ujimasa's forces away from Suruga and into Kanto, and it worked like a charm. Having achieved this, Shingen retreated back to Kofu in October and prepared to invade Suruga a third time. This time, Shingen would be successful. He captured Kambara Castle in early December, and this caused the remaining Hojo troops in the area to retreat. With the road open, the Takeda forces captured Sumpu, and from then on advanced at a slower pace until in December of 1571, 2 months after the death of Hojo Ieyasu, the two clans made peace and signed a new alliance between them, bringing the third invasion of Suruga to an end and the province becoming part of Shingen's domain, with the exception of a few small parts that remained under Hojo control. While Takeda Shingen was fighting the Hojo left and right to secure his hold on Suruga, Tokugawa Ieyasu was solidifying his control of Totomi. In early 1570, he transferred his capital from Okazaki to Hikuma, which he renamed Hamamatsu, and expanded upon its castle town and defenses. He passed the ancestral seat of the Matsudaira to his eldest son Nobuyasu. Only a few months later, Ieyasu would find himself embroiled in a new conflict as his trusted ally, Oda Nobunaga, had a fallout with Shogun Ashikaga Yoshiaki and was at war with the Asakura clan of Echizen. Details of this conflict can be found in our Nobunaga video, so for now it will suffice to say that Ieyasu and his men followed the Oda force in Echizen, capturing 2 forts at Tezusuyama and Kanagasaki. However, the Azai clan of Omi sided with the Asakura and were now marching, threatening to encircle the Oda Tokugawa army. Upon hearing of this, Nobunaga called for a war council, in which an immediate retreat was decided, with Ieyasu and Toyotomi Hideyoshi appointed to lead the rearguard and hold off the Asakura forces that were pursuing them. With the enemy fast approaching Kanagasaki Castle, where the Oda camp was located, Nobunaga was forced to flee, following a mountain road. Hideyoshi, having a cunning plan, would defend Nobunaga's rear and delay the Asakura Azai forces as much as he could. He gave orders to his men to erect numerous flags around the castle, even keeping Nobunaga's personal standard, and to light more fires during the night so as to give the impression of a larger force. The Azai and Asakura forces fell for the trick and decided to set up camp for the night and to attack the following day. Taking advantage of this, Hideyoshi launched a sudden assault on the Asakura camp just before dawn, threw their army into disarray, and even managed to get a hefty amount of spoils before ultimately retreating all the way to Kyoto's safety, sporadically fighting off the enemy troops. He would return to Omi province to fight once more against the Azai-Asakura alliance in the Battle of Anegawa, successfully leading his troops for the first time in the open field. There, on the northern bank of the river, the Azai and Asakura had deployed their combined armies, numbering no more than 20,000 men. Initially, Ieyasu was supposed to form his army opposite the Azai, who were fewer in number than the Asakura. However, since Nobunaga harbored personal hate towards Azai Nagamasa, they switched positions, and Ieyasu deployed his hardened Mikawa Bushi on the west side, opposite the Asakura troops. Sakai Tadetsugu and Ishikawa Kazumasa led Ieyasu's vanguard, while Honda Tadakatsu and Sakakibara Yasumasa the rearguard. The battle was largely won thanks to Ieyasu's experienced soldiers, who broke the Asakura forces and attacked the Azai on the right flank. After this, Inaba Etetsu attacked the Azai on their left flank, forcing them to flee the battlefield. With the Azai and Asakura on the back foot, Nobunaga was able to handle the situation by himself, so Ieyasu returned to Hamamatsu. As we have already mentioned, Shingen concluded his conquest of Tsuruga in the autumn. After allying himself with the Hojo to secure his rear, he decided to march all the way to Kyoto, heeding the call of Shogun Yoshiaki, who was more or less begging for someone to save him from Nobunaga. In October of 1572, after waiting for the winter snows to block the northern passes that would prevent his rival Kenshin from coming down, Shingen led a 30,000-strong force into Totomi. His forces were further bolstered by an additional 2,000-strong regiment that was lent to him by Hojo Ujimasa. At the same time, another division, numbering some 5,000 warriors, led by Yamagata Masakage, marched towards Mikawa. Ieyasu sent a small reconnaissance force of around 3,000 men under Okubo Tadio and Honda Tadakatsu, but they were unable to achieve anything. Meanwhile, Masakage was able to link up with the main force after taking Yoshida Castle, which captured Kakegawa and Futamata. Shingen was now fast approaching Ieyasu and his 8,000 men at his stronghold in Hamamatsu. However, the first foreign banners Ieyasu's men watched approaching from their towers did not belong to the daimyo of Kai, but to Nobunaga, who had heeded his allies' plea for help and dispatched 3,000 men under Sakuma Nobumori, Hirate Hirohide, and Takegawa Kazumasu. This number might seem small, but we must also remember that Nobunaga was already invested in his own conflicts, and his forces were already spread thin. With the arrival of the Oda forces, Ieyasu held a war council, where Nobunaga's generals advised him to assume a defensive stance. However, in a rare case of carelessness, Ieyasu decided to take the field and led his forces out to a plain called Mikatagahara, not even a mile north of Hamamatsu. There he deployed his army in a stork's wing formation, using the Magome River to cover his right flank. Behind the long front line followed the main body, commanded by Ieyasu himself. On his right he placed Nobunaga's men, and on the extreme right flank there was another group of Mikawa samurai led by Sakai Tadasugu. On the left flank, he placed men under Ogasawara Nagayoshi, Matsudaira Ietada, Honda Tadakatsu, and Ishikawa Kazumasa. Shingen had deployed his own forces in a fish-scale formation, with Oyamada Nobushige leading the vanguard, Naito Masatoyo and Yamagata Masakage in the second line, his son Katsuyori and Obata Masamori in the third, and Baba Nobuharu in the rear. Further behind was Shingen himself, commanding 15,000 men. It was during a light snowfall, around 4 in the afternoon, when the Takeda unleashed their first frontal assault towards Ieyasu's position. Ieyasu had a number of arquebus-equipped ashigaru and was hoping that the Takeda assault would be broken by their volleys. However, they proved ineffective, and Shingen's men crashed into Ieyasu's two flanks. The left flank, which was made up of Mikawa troops and led by more experienced generals like Tadakatsu, was able to resist and even push back the assault. That was not the case for the Oda men, who were overwhelmed. Sekima and Takegawa turned tail and retreated, while Hirohide perished in the fight and his men fled. Thus, Sakai Tadasugu was left isolated in the extreme right and was pushed back towards the main body. Taking advantage of his vast numbers, Shingen rotated his forces and threw fresh regiments into combat. Facing the renewed Takeda assault, even the hardened Mikawa troops began faltering and retreating en masse. In an attempt to rally them back, Ieyasu ordered Okubo Tadio to plant his standard, a giant golden fan, on a hill near Saigedake to serve as a rally point. He himself went to assist Mizuno Tadashige, who had been trapped fighting two of Shingen's divisions. It was a completely suicidal decision, and Ieyasu would have perished there had not one of his retainers, by the name of Natsume Yoshinobu, intervened. It is said that Yoshinobu struck Ieyasu's horse with the back of his sword, sending it running towards the rear, while he screamed, "I am Tokugawa Ieyasu," and charged towards the Takeda soldiers who had almost surrounded Tokugawa's bodyguard and met his end. As for Ieyasu, he barely escaped and made his way to Hamamatsu, where he ordered for the gates to remain open and for big fires to be lit, employing the empty fort stratagem. It was a risky move, but it worked. As Yamagata Masakage and Baba Nobuharu approached the castle, they were puzzled by the situation and dared not to attack. That night, just to reinforce their assumption that the Tokugawa had not been entirely defeated, Ieyasu sent Okubo Tadio and Amano Yasukage with a small band of men to raid the Takeda camp near the Saiga cliff. However, this story is considered anecdotal, as is another tale regarding Hattori Hanzo's rearguard action that held off the Takeda troops with a group of shinobi. Unfortunately, these tales lack much historical validity as no contemporary sources mention them. In any case, Takeda Shingen had been successfully convinced that Tokugawa Ieyasu had still some fighting force to oppose him. He was also worried about Oda Nobunaga coming to his allies' assistance, and Uesugi Kenshin taking advantage of his absence from Kai. He and his generals therefore decided that the best course of action was to retreat to Kai and come back next year. Fortunately for Ieyasu, Shingen would not live that long. While besieging Noda Castle in Mikawa not even a month later, the legendary Tiger of Kai fell ill, while another popular tale tells that the Takeda daimyo fell victim to one of the snipers posted on the castle's ramparts, who shot Shingen in the head when the latter approached the castle walls to better hear a flute player. In any case, by April of 1573, Shingen had passed away, and Ieyasu had dodged a great threat. That year, Nobunaga suffered a rather humiliating defeat at the hands of the militant monks of Nagashino during the second siege of the castle. In 1573, he would assist his daimyo in the second siege of Nagashima against the militant monks. Hideyoshi led a diversionary force from the west, while Nobunaga's main body, which included his arquebusiers, committed to a frontal assault. However, because of the rainy weather, the gunpowder became damp, rendering the firearms nearly useless. This surprising turn of events allowed the Ikkō-ikki to launch a decisive counterattack, smashing the Oda forces with their own arquebuses and forcing Nobunaga to retreat until the next year. Hideyoshi would also be present at the siege of Odani Castle, the Azai clan's stronghold, that same year, and for his contributions thus far, he would be rewarded with some of their lands in the rich Omi province that was valued at 120,000 koku. Hideyoshi, now a daimyo, would attentively develop the lands he was given. Special care was given to the firearms factory in Kunitomo that had been established earlier jointly by the Azai and the Asakura, and under Hideyoshi's guidance, the factory was expanded, and its production dramatically increased to satisfy the needs of Nobunaga's army. The war with the Takeda clan did not stop with Shingen's passing. A year after his death, Takeda Katsuyori, who had succeeded his father as head of the clan, invaded Mikawa. In June, he laid siege to the castle of Nagashino, whose defences were commanded by Okudaira Sedamasa. Katsuyori's campaign had started with the best omens, for he had even secured the assistance of Oga Yashiro, the Daikan of Mikawa, who was in charge of financial matters in the area and wielded significant authority. Yashiro's arrogance made him turn traitor towards Ieyasu, and he offered to help Katsuyori should he invade Mikawa by opening the gates of Okazaki Castle. Thus bolstered by this turn of events, Katsuyori marched into Ieyasu's land. Unbeknownst to him, Yashiro's betrayal had been discovered, and he and his family had been captured and had met a very gruesome end. Despite taking care of the traitorous Yashiro, Ieyasu knew that he could not take on the larger Takeda force alone, and so sent for Oda Nobunaga, who resided at Gifu, to assist him. Meanwhile, the situation at Nagashino was getting more dire by the day. Katsuyori's frontal assaults against the castle's walls had failed, but food was running out fast, and Sadamasa's men wouldn't be able to hold much more after that. This was the message Torii Tsunemon, one of the castle's defenders, brought to Ieyasu after slipping past the Takeda lines one night. Tsunemon then made the return journey, carrying with him the promises of both Ieyasu and Nobunaga that they would make haste to relieve the siege. Unfortunately, this time he was captured by the Takeda soldiers, who became aware that someone had escaped the castle and tightened their defences. Katsuyori offered a deal to Tsunemon, his life in exchange for aid in deceiving the castle's garrison into believing that no help was coming and they should surrender. However, when Tsunemon stood outside the walls, he shouted that their lord was coming to relieve the siege. As punishment for this brave act and firm loyalty to Ieyasu, Tsunemon was crucified by the Takeda. With little hope of capturing the castle before the combined Oda Tokugawa armies would reach him, Katsuyori held a war council with his generals. The older and wiser of them opted for a retreat back into Kai, but Katsuyori and the younger generals wanted to stay and fight, and so it was decided that they would give battle there. Staying true to their promise, Nobunaga and Ieyasu arrived on the evening of the 27th, 6 miles west of Nagashino at Shidahara with a combined force of 38,000 men. They quickly took up positions on the ridgeline behind a small stream called Rengogawa as a countermeasure to the feared Takeda cavalry. Seeking to provide further protection for his arquebusiers, Nobunaga ordered the construction of a palisade with a few gaps here and there so as to allow possible counterattacks. His plan was to use rotating volleys of arquebus fire to decimate the Takeda's famed cavalry charge, while his spearmen would protect the missile troops. On the dawn of the 28th, the Allied battle line stood as follows. The extreme right flank of the Tokugawa army was secured by 1,000 men, led by Okubo Tadao. His position was the only one not covered by the fence, but instead was only protected by some trees. Next to him were Ōsuka Yasutaka and Sakakibara Yasumasa, each in charge of 1,000 men as well. Next in line was the warrior who surpassed death itself, the famous Honda Tadaketsu, who was leading a similarly sized regiment, while behind him stood his daimyo, Tokugawa Ieyasu, with 2,000 men. On the left flank of the Tokugawa forces, close to the center of the overall line, were Ishikawa Kazumasa and Torii Mototada, with 1,800 respectively, while behind them was Ieyasu's son Nobuyasu, in command of 1,000 soldiers. Next to Torii stood the 1st Oda contingent under Takigawa Kazumatsu. On his left, occupying the center of the Oda forces, was Nobunaga's star general Hashiba Hideyoshi, who had the honor of guarding his lord, who had placed his headquarters behind him. Next along were Niue Nagahide and Mizuno Nobumoto, while the rear was supported by Sakuma Nobumori. On the other side of the Rengogawa, Katsuyori split his army into 5 divisions, each numbering 3,000 men. One was left to continue the siege on the castle, and another would serve as reserves under his personal command. On the right flank was Baba Nobuharu, in the center was Naito Kiyonaga, and Yamagata Masakage was on the left flank. At around 6 AM, the Takeda cavalry charged towards the entrenched Allied positions, Masakage's contingent being the first to make contact, with the other generals following suit. Yet every attack had the same bloody fate, as Nobunaga's gunners mowed down Japan's finest cavalry with alternating volleys, though some modern scholars dispute this and argue that the Oda arquebusiers discharged their guns en masse instead. Those who escaped the bullets found themselves against a hail of blades from Oda and Tokugawa spearmen. On the Takeda right flank, Baba Nobuharu had made some progress, but was then met by a detachment led by Shibata Katsuie and Hashiba Hideyoshi. While the fight raged on the banks of the Rengogawa River, Sekai Tadatsugu with 3,500 men attacked the Takeda forces who were still at Nagashino. They had secretly moved during the night and approached the besiegers from the rear. Watching Tadatsugu's assault from the walls of Nagashino, Okudaira Sadamasa gave the order for the garrison to sally out, and despite being weakened from hunger and illness, they inflicted great damage to the Takeda troops. Back at Shidahara, Katsuyori decided to fully commit, ordering a general attack and throwing in the last of his reserves. Yet even these fresh troops weren't able to dislodge the Oda Ashigaru from their defenses. The bloody struggle between the two forces continued until 1 hour after noon, when Nobunaga gave the order for the Oda troops to fall back on the fences. This was the opportunity the battered Takeda soldiers waited for, and retreated on the road back towards Kai. Seeing this action, Nobunaga changed his orders, now shouting to his men to pursue their opponents. This they did, slaughtering and capturing many of the Takeda, some of which were prominent samurai. In total, around 10,000 heads were taken that day by the Oda men. Among the dead were some of the most notable Takeda leaders, like Baba Nobuharu, Naito Kiyonaga, the Sanada brothers, and Yamagata Masakage. Nagashino was a great victory for the Oda Tokugawa side, and gave Ieyasu plenty of breathing room, allowing him to go on the offensive and capture many fortresses. Though significantly weakened, Katsuyori and the Takeda were far from falling, and 7 more years of fighting awaited Ieyasu before he would finally be able to put down his opponent. Over the coming years, Hideyoshi would be at the forefront, fighting where Nobunaga needed him the most, like the siege against the warrior monks of Ishiyama Hongan-ji, or the Battle of Todorigawa against Uesugi Kenshin. But of these later wars in service of Nobunaga, there was one that would change Hashiba Hideyoshi's life forever: the Chugoku campaign against the powerful Mori clan of Aki province. The Mori and their allies controlled the western part of Honshu, and because of the narrow geography of the region, armies didn't have much room to maneuver around fortified positions. Combined with their military might, it meant that a war against the Mori would take many years, even for the most brilliant of generals. In 1577, Nobunaga entrusted this campaign to two of his best generals, Hideyoshi and Akechi Mitsuhide. Mitsuhide would advance with his forces along the northern Sanindo Road, attacking through Wakasa and Tamba provinces. While initially both men were successful, the difference in their caliber as generals would soon become apparent. Hideyoshi, who was a master at siegecraft and possessed of a silver tongue, continued advancing further west, albeit at a slow but steady pace, either by directly assaulting the castles that stood on his path or by bribing their commanders. On the other hand, Mitsuhide's progress came to a grinding halt at Tamba, where he faced stiff resistance. When Hideyoshi entered Harima province, he had a hidden ace, Kuroda Yoshitaka, better known in Japanese history as Kuroda Kanbei, a brilliant political and military strategist. Kanbei had realized the Oda, not the Mori, were the clan to bet on, and had offered his services to Hideyoshi and Nobunaga. He had even promised to act as a diplomatic mediator for the bloodless capture of Himeji Castle, which belonged to his father-in-law Kidera Masamoto. Himeji, which stands to this day, would indeed be turned over in 1580, and after remodeling it, Hideyoshi would use it as his personal residence. With Kanbei's assistance, Harima province was secured quickly, with Hideyoshi besieging any castles that defied him, the most important of which was Kazuki on the western border of the province, commanded by Akamatsu Masanori. The castle would change hands the following year, as Hideyoshi had suffered a major setback and did not have enough troops to defend it. Besho Nagaharu, who owned Miki Castle, had rebelled against Nobunaga, seemingly out of his hate towards Hashiba Hideyoshi and his humble origins, and perhaps due to a massacre committed by his troops against the garrison and the civilians of Kazuki. 5 months later, he was joined by Araki Murashige. In the face of such a danger threatening his rear, Hideyoshi had to return to eastern Harima and put down the rebellion. In 1580, he was finally able to take Miki, though not everything went according to his plan, as Nagaharu chose to commit seppuku rather than pledge his loyalty to the Oda. Meanwhile, Araki had managed to escape from the siege of Itami Castle, where he was held up, and had found refuge at the court of Mori Teramoto. With that matter settled, Hideyoshi was now able to continue his campaign westwards to Bizen province. He would do so without his close friend and chief strategist Takenaka Hanbei, who had passed away the year prior due to chronic illness. Thankfully, military action against Bizen was not needed. The daimyo of the province, Ukita Noye, who also owned the neighbouring Mimasaka province, having witnessed the fate of Besho Nagaharu, was more than willing to submit to Nobunaga's rule. Therefore, Hideyoshi ordered him to resist any attacks from Mori Teramoto's forces, while he himself moved north to Inaba province to lay siege at the castle of Tottori, owned by Yamada Toyokuni, who promptly fled, leaving command to Kukawa Tsuneye. Tsuneye, however, was a general directly under the service of the Mori clan, and was thus determined to hold Tottori to the bitter end. As offers of peaceful surrender fell on deaf ears, Hideyoshi would show a rare fit of merciless brutality. First, he drove the peasants from nearby villages into the besieged castle to impose a heavier tax on its food reserves. Then he built towers every 500 meters along the perimeter of the castle, and bought all the rice produced by the province. He then simply waited for the garrison to starve to death. His arquebusiers shot anyone who dared to venture outside the castle, yet the garrison still refused to surrender. This lasted for over 200 days, until the besieged men were forced to eat their dead comrades. It was then that Tsuneye agreed to surrender and took his own life. Following these successes, Hideyoshi deemed it proper to visit Nobunaga and exchange gifts to stay on the Oda warlord's good side. Meanwhile, things were going well for Ieyasu, or at least seemed to be, as he had prevailed in Nagashino against the mighty Takeda clan, which, even without Shingen's leadership, was a formidable foe. However, the war was not yet over. Each side often conducted raids into the other's territory, but each time they retreated back without giving a decisive battle. It was during this time that tragedy struck Ieyasu's own household, with the cause being none other than his own wife. As we saw in the previous episodes about Ieyasu's life, his first wife, Lady Tsukiyama, was related to the Anegawa clan. Her husband's actions against Ujizane had cost her her father's life, something she never truly forgave him for. The chasm between the couple deepened after 1570, when Ieyasu relocated his quarters to Hamamatsu, while she remained behind in Okazaki, where her son Nobuyasu and his wife also resided. In her absence, Ieyasu would not remain faithful. It was not uncommon for the lords of that time to have many consorts, but Ieyasu's list of concubines was as big as a telephone book, and at one point he even had a child, his second son, with Tsukiyama's handmaiden. In contrast, Tokugawa Nobuyasu's marriage to Oda Nobunaga's eldest daughter, Tokihime, seems to have been relatively happy, despite reports that portray Nobuyasu as a rather unpleasant and unpopular man prone to anger and violence. The couple had 2 daughters together, but no son, something that displeased Tsukiyama Dono, and who, like a proper meddling mother-in-law, made sure Tokihime knew it. She was adamant that a lord must have a son, and it was therefore her son's duty to find a woman capable of providing him with an heir. Nobuyasu, seeing the logic behind his mother's words, was easily convinced. Therefore, Lady Tsukiyama arranged for him to take as a concubine the daughter of a samurai who was a former retainer of Takeda Katsuyori, and who had been driven away from her home. Naturally, this created a deep divide between Tsukiyama and Tokihime. Alas, her plotting didn't stop there. Through a Chinese doctor called Genkei, she began exchanging correspondence with Katsuyori himself, asking him to attack Nobunaga and her own husband. Unbeknownst to her, however, one of her ladies-in-waiting was related to one of Tokihime's, both likely having been sent by Nobunaga to act as spies. She managed to discover the incriminating letters, which soon found their way to her daughter-in-law's hands, and from there to the Oda clan's daimyo. While Tsukiyama Dono's involvement in the plot was undeniable, since this was her correspondence, it wasn't long before Nobuyasu's name was also implicated. But for that, Nobunaga would need further proof. This came in the form of Sakae Tadetsugu's testimony, who, when visiting Nobunaga to deliver some horses as a gift from Ieyasu, was asked if Nobuyasu had anything to do with the plot. Tadetsugu, likely out of personal grudge against the man, did nothing to save his lord's eldest son, and instead confirmed that he indeed was part of the plot. With proof of the scheme's existence in the form of Lady Tsukiyama's letters and Tadetsugu's testimony, Nobunaga messaged Ieyasu, informing him of his traitorous son and wife, and asking for Nobuyasu to end his life immediately. Even to this day, we don't know if Nobuyasu was involved in the plot, or even if he had the faintest idea of what was going on, but by most accounts he was likely innocent. When Nobunaga's messenger reached Hamamatsu, Ieyasu was caught between a rock and a hard place. On one hand, he didn't want to sacrifice his eldest son, whom he had groomed as his heir, and had shown great promise as a military commander. On the other hand, he had to think about the good of his clan as a whole, and for that he couldn't afford to lose his alliance with the Oda and incur Nobunaga's wrath. In the end, he placed the greater good over his son's life, and ordered for Nobuyasu to be placed under house arrest, first in Ohama and later in Futamata, where at his father's order he would commit seppuku. Ieyasu sent 2 of his retainers, Hattori Hanzo and Amakata Michitsuna, to act as observers, with the latter also acting as the Kaishakunin, assisting Nobuyasu in his path to the next life. Although Nobunaga had probably not asked any such thing, Ieyasu would also order the death of his wife, who was guilty beyond any doubt, likely out of resentment for having cost him the life of his firstborn son. Therefore, one of Ieyasu's retainers was sent to Okazaki and took her head. A few days later, Nobuyasu followed his mother. While still mourning the death of his son, Ieyasu also continued his war with the Takeda. In the following year, Ieyasu prepared to recapture Taketenjin Castle, which Katsuyori had seized from him during his invasion of Mikawa in 1575. To this goal, he constructed 5 new castles around Taketenjin and renovated the old Okehazama fort, effectively cutting off the castle from any possible assistance Katsuyori could offer. Despite repeated attempts by the castle's commander, Okabe Motonobu, to offer other castles in exchange for Taketenjin to be spared, the siege continued until March of 1581, when the starving garrison sallied out to meet a heroic end. It's not very hard to imagine that Katsuyori's inability to assist his own vassal during the siege did not earn him many sympathizers. The divide between him and his own retainers grew even larger, when in the same year he constructed a new castle at Shimpu, proclaimed it his new capital and moved in, forcing his retainers to follow him. This was a deviation from the clan's traditional strategy, as Shingen did not favor static defenses. Both his generals and his soldiers viewed it as a sign of weakness and lost confidence in his leadership. Another blow to Katsuyori's authority came in the first month of the following year, when Kiso Yoshinaka, lord of the Kiso Fukushima castle in Shinano, revolted against the Takeda. Katsuyori took the field to punish his rebellious vassal, but made little headway. That following month, a much bigger threat presented itself, as Nobunaga declared an all-out invasion of Takeda lands alongside his trustworthy allies, Tokugawa Ieyasu and the Hojo of Odawara. As you may remember from our previous episode, the Hojo were traditionally allied to the Takeda until Shingen invaded Suruga and their political alliance was dismantled. Despite this, familial ties remained between the two families, as Katsuyori had taken Hojo Ujiyasu's daughter for his second wife, when his first wife and Nobunaga's adopted daughter, Toyama Fujin, died in childbirth. Still, Katsuyori made sure to drive a further wedge between his clan and the Hojo by supporting and allying himself with Uesugi Kagekatsu in 1579. Thus, by 1582, the Hojo had joined the long list of the people that wanted Katsuyori gone. The massive Oda Tokugawa army marched through Takeda lands. They faced little opposition, as Katsuyori's vassals preferred to flee or surrender than to put up a fight. Even some of his relatives, like Aneyama Baisetsu, who was his cousin, decided to throw their lot in with the enemy. For those who remained true and resisted, such as Katsuyori's younger brother, Nishina Morinobu, only death awaited. Morinobu was in charge of defending Taketo Castle, which came under siege by the forces of Oba Nobutada, Nobunaga's eldest son, who also acted as overall commander of the Oda troops in his father's absence. Nobutada offered to spare Morinobu's life, but the entire Taketo garrison fought to the last man. The fall of Taketo Castle led to the rest of the Takeda garrisons in Kai surrendering on sight. Meanwhile, Ieyasu himself made swift progress, capturing Kakigawa, Makino, Tanaka, Sumpu, and Manjudo in Kai. At the same time, the Hojo forces had reached Kai's eastern border. Katsuyori was trapped. Realizing his dire position, and knowing Shimpu's defenses were not strong enough to withstand a siege by such a large force, Katsuyori decided to flee the castle in early March, taking with him no more than 600 samurai and a few hundred women and children who were his kin. They first attempted to reach Iwadano Castle, whose lord Oyamada Nobushige had offered to shelter and help Katsuyori. But once they reached the mountain fort, Nobushige turned them away, having changed his mind and sided with Nobunaga. Without a stronghold, Katsuyori's party made its way towards the Tenmokuzen Seiyunji Temple. However, their numbers were continuously dropping on the way as his men abandoned their lord to save themselves. In the end, Katsuyori's force numbered no more than 100 souls, more than half women and children. Among them were Katsuyori's sons and his wife, who chose to stay by her husband's side, despite his plea for her to escape back to her family in Odawara. On the 11th of March, the Oda forces, possibly alerted by nearby villagers, pinpointed their position and began their attack. Katsuyori's men had nothing left to lose, and knowing certain death awaited them, they fought bravely, inflicting many casualties. But their fate was sealed, and those who didn't die by their enemies' blades took their own lives. Katsuyori and his eldest son, Nobukatsu, stood side by side, and one after the other, they committed seppuku. This was the tragic epilogue to Katsuyori's life, and the end of the main branch of the Takeda clan. We return our focus to Hideyoshi, who, after spending some time with his family in early 1582, marched again to the front. Subjugating the island province of Oeji in just 20 days, he moved towards his main goal, Bichu province. There, not far from the border, he would encounter his first obstacle, the castle of Takamatsu, which Shimizu Muneharu held. As in previous times, Hideyoshi initially offered a diplomatic solution, enticing Muneharu to switch sides in exchange for lordship over all of Bitchu province. While the offer was extremely good, Muneharu remained loyal to his Mori overlord. The siege would not be easy, as the castle was located advantageously on a small hill that was surrounded by completely flat terrain. The river Ashimori that flowed to the west and a large moat also contributed to the fortress's defences. But Hideyoshi was a master of siegecraft and would turn the castle's advantages into his own. Thus he filled large bags with sand and raised a large bank on the south side of the castle, while also digging a channel to divert the water from the river towards Takamatsu. As the rainy season arrived in June, the water created an artificial lake around the castle, cutting it off from the outside world. The flooding plan had worked, and the castle was hardly inhabitable, so the garrison of Takamatsu sought outside help. The threat Hideyoshi posed was deemed big enough for Mori Teramoto to intervene by personally leading a relief force. Upon hearing this, Hideyoshi sent a messenger to Oda Nobunaga in Kyoto to request reinforcement for the upcoming and possibly decisive battle against the Mori. After spending several days with Nobunaga, Ieyasu and his entourage had departed to continue their tour of Kansai, while Nobunaga received Hideyoshi's request for aid. In late June, and after urgently gathering his personal guard, Nobunaga left the safety of Azuchi and rode to Kyoto, accompanied by his eldest son and heir, Nobutada. With him was also his African bodyguard, Yasuke. The young man had first arrived in Japan in 1579 and met with the Oda warlord in Kyoto in 1581. Impressed by the man's physical strength and his color, which had caused quite the sensation among the citizens of the capital, Nobunaga took him into his service. It is possible he even made him a samurai, as well as his weapons bearer, and was the one to give him his Japanese name. When Nobunaga and his small party reached Kyoto, he decided to stop and spend the night at Honnō-ji Temple, which was his favorite place to take lodgings whenever he visited the capital. However, the majority of his troops, as well as his son, were billeted in a separate location. Meanwhile, in the nearby Sakamoto Castle, Nobunaga's general, Akechi Mitsuhide, had gathered his forces in order to assist Hideyoshi, as he had been commanded by his lord earlier. On the afternoon of the 20th of June, he departed from Sakamoto and led his troops as far as the Katsura River. There he ordered his men to halt, and addressed them with one phrase that would change the fate of Japan forever. "The enemy is at Honnō-ji," he proclaimed, and with that, he turned his army around and marched towards Kyoto and the unsuspecting Nobunaga. Before the sun had risen, Mitsuhide's men, under the command of his son-in-law, stormed the temple where Nobunaga was residing. The Oda Daimyo was awoken by the sounds, thinking a brawl between his own men had broken out, but he was soon informed that it was an enemy force that had surrounded the temple. Nobunaga asked who had plotted against him, and his page, Mori Ranmaru, told him that these men belonged to Akechi Mitsuhide. Nobunaga stoically replied that what's done is done, and went to grab his bow, while his guards struggled to fight off their assailants. Nobunaga shot a few arrows at his would-be assassins until the string of the bow snapped, and he switched to a spear. Ordering his women to escape, he continued to fight until he sustained a spear wound in his elbow. Realizing there was no escape, he ordered Ranmaru and his brothers to set the complex aflame to prevent Mitsuhide from taking his body, and retired to one of the inner rooms to commit seppuku. Another figure that also likely perished in the flames of Honnō-ji was Nobunaga's first wife, Nohime. According to legend, she died while fighting off the attackers with her naginata, but there are also theories that she somehow managed to escape. Among those who fought loyally to protect their master's life was Yasuke. However, with Nobunaga's fate sealed, the African warrior had no choice but to escape the burning temple and make his way to Nijo-Gosho, where Nobutada had made his quarters and was under attack by Akechi's men as well. Nobutada had planned to spend the night at Myokakuji until news of his father reached him. He originally wanted to make his way to Honnō-ji and assist him, but his retainers informed him that it was already too late, and the most prudent course of action was to head to Nijo-Gosho, which had stronger defenses. There, once again, his retainers tried to convince him to escape the city and head for Azuchi. But Nobutada had made up his mind, stating that those who planned a revolt of such magnitude would not let him live, and he could not stand the shame of being captured by common foot soldiers. his speech moved his few retainers, who decided to stay at the castle and fight. They put up a stalwart defense at the gate, but after a while, some of Akechi's soldiers climbed onto the roof of a nearby building, and being able to see the defenders over the walls, they began picking them off with bows and firearms. Each casualty was irreplaceable, and soon Mitsuhide's men breached the gate and set the castle ablaze. Nobutada retired, and he too took his life, after ordering one of his retainers to hide his body. Yasuke was brought before Akechi, who declared that he would spare him because he was just an animal. It is possible that Akechi's harsh words did not reflect his true feelings towards Yasuke, and instead he sought to spare the man's life by insulting him in such a way, possibly to avoid problems with the Jesuits. Following this, Nobunaga's former African page was returned to the custody of the Jesuits, who had brought him to Japan, and from then on, he vanished from history. In just one fateful night, Akechi Mitsuhide had managed to deliver a devastating blow to the entire Oda clan, and threatened to undo everything Nobunaga had achieved by that point. That same day, he marched from Kyoto to Uesugi, but he was unable to find the remaining Oda family members, who had already fled. He was content with looting the treasures Nobunaga had collected there. In the aftermath, the mighty fortress was burned to the ground, with sources attributing this cultural tragedy to various culprits. At that time, Ieyasu was also in the vicinity, albeit with only a handful of retainers accompanying him, as Nobunaga had invited him to a tour of Kansai to celebrate their victory over the Takeda. Ieyasu was staying at the port city of Sakai when word of Mitsuhide's betrayal got to him. He contemplated a direct attack on Mitsuhide with his small band of retainers to avenge Nobunaga's death. He even thought of committing seppuku to follow his senior ally and friend to the grave. Thankfully, however, he was persuaded by his men that it would be better to escape back to the safety of Mikawa, gather an army, and then avenge Nobunaga's death. The escape was not an easy one, as Mitsuhide's men were searching for them, and the area was filled with bandits. By bribing and at other times intimidating their adversaries, they managed to reach Iga province, where the knowledge of Hattori Hanzo, a native of Iga, came in handy. As many of the Igaji samurai were positively predisposed towards the Tokugawa clan, they helped Ieyasu and his party and safely escorted them to the port of Shirako, where they boarded a merchant ship heading for the safety of Mikawa. The flames of Honnō-ji had thrown not just the Oda clan, but the entire country off balance. By a stroke of luck, Hideyoshi intercepted a messenger that Mitsuhide sent to Teramoto to forge an alliance. Informed of Nobunaga's passing and the power vacuum that had occurred in the Gulf of the Oda clan, Hideyoshi moved quickly and decisively. He hastily concluded a peace treaty with the Mori on seemingly good terms for them. They had to surrender the provinces of Mimisaka, Bitchu and Hoki, lands that were essentially already controlled by the Oda. Unaware of the events surrounding Honnō-ji, Teramoto agreed, and Hideyoshi force-marched his army, covering the distance from Takamatsu to Kyoto in just 5 days. Akechi, probably unaware of Hideyoshi marching towards him at warp speed, did little to fortify his position. He tried to gather the support of Kyoto's citizens by reducing taxes, and even secured the gratitude and support of the imperial court. The only problem was that the emperor at that time had no authority. Mitsuhide also extended a hand of friendship towards other former Oda allies, like the Tosokabe, Hosokawa, Takayama, Nakagawa, and Tsutsui clans, with no success. Tosokabe Motochika was too far to intervene, not to mention embroiled in his own campaigns in Shikoku. Takayama Ukon and Nakagawa Kiyohide sided with Hideyoshi, while Tsutsui Junkei stayed out of the conflict. The Hosokawa, despite their family ties with Akechi, were staunch Oda loyalists. In fact, Hosokawa Tadaoki, Mitsuhide's son-in-law, was so appalled by this betrayal that he immediately divorced his wife. His father, Hosokawa Fujitaka, opted to turn to a monastic life and became a Buddhist monk. Akechi Mitsuhide would have to face Hideyoshi without allies. At the Hashiba camp, the outgoing and silver-tongued Hideyoshi had no shortage of allies. Just as his troops were passing outside Osaka, they were joined by Niwa Nagahide, another great general of the Oda clan, and Oda Nobutaka, Nobunaga's third son. They were stationed at Sakai, making preparations to invade Shikoku when the events of Honnō-ji occurred. For Hideyoshi, having Nobutaka on his side was a big advantage, as Nobunaga's son added legitimacy to his cause. The stage was set for the two rivals to clash when the two armies met near the village of Yamazaki, an area advantageous for Akechi's smaller army, as the nearby rivers and castles would prevent envelopment maneuvers from Hideyoshi's larger corps. Upon reaching the area of the battlefield, Hideyoshi realized that the key to victory was the nearby forested hill of Tenozan that overlooked the road to Kyoto. For that reason, he dispatched a regiment under Nakagawa Kiyohide with the mission to secure it, which he did without any difficulties, thus giving Hideyoshi and his army the advantage of high ground. That same night, he also sent a group of shinobi into Mitsuhide's camp. The ninjas lit fires in huts and other buildings where Akechi's men were spending the night, causing much confusion among the troops and lowering their morale. The following morning, Hideyoshi deployed his troops behind the bank of the river Enmyojigawa, opposite Mitsuhide's forces, with Takeyama Ukon and Hori Hidemasa leading the vanguard. The battle began with Mitsuhide's forces charging forward, the hill of Tenozan becoming a highly contested point. Matsuda Masachika and Nabika Kamon tried to wrestle control of the mount from Hideyoshi's troops, but came under heavy fire from the latter's arquebusiers. With Tenozan firmly under his control, Hideyoshi felt confident enough to launch his counterattack, ordering forces on his right flank, under the command of Ikeda Tsuneyoki and Kato Mitsuyasu, to cross the river and charge Suda Nobuharu's corps. Despite facing stiff resistance, they managed to push and slowly turn towards the center of Mitsuhide's formation. At that point, Hideyoshi also committed his left wing to the fierce melee. This proved to be too much for the Akechi forces, who broke ranks and began routing in large numbers. Watching the armies collapse, Mimaki Kaniaki sent a messenger to Mitsuhide, urging him to flee to safety, while he and 200 of his men tried to buy some time by charging the lines of Hashiba's troops. With no choice left, Mitsuhide initially retreated to Shoryuji Castle, but understanding that he would be surrounded and would not last long in this position, he attempted to flee during the night, with only 20 of his most trusted men escorting him. His goal was to reach his very own Sakamoto Castle, but he wouldn't make it past the village of Ogurisu. There, while crossing a bamboo grove, he was ambushed by a band of peasants, with a villager wounding him at his side with a bamboo spear. Drawing his last breaths, Akechi Mitsuhide committed suicide, with his head later being recovered and given to Hideyoshi, who in turn brought it to Honnō-ji, presented it to Nobunaga's spirit, and then placed it on a spike for the people of Kyoto to see, the fate of a common criminal. Akechi's 11-day rule was over, but for Hashiba Hideyoshi to rule the land, he would first need to elevate himself above the rest of the Oda generals and Nobunaga's sons. While the prestige of being the one to defeat the traitor Mitsuhide was a significant boost, it was not enough. At the same time, Ieyasu had turned his gaze towards the east, and especially the recently conquered lands of Kai and Shinano that just a few months ago belonged to the Takeda clan. With the ultimate defeat of Katsuyori, the lands passed to Oda control. Thereafter, Nobunaga appointed Hidetaka Kawajiri to rule most of Kai, Nageyoshi Mori the majority of Shinano, and Kazumasu Takigawa the entirety of Kozuke. Ieyasu rightfully suspected that the samurai of these provinces had little loyalty for their new masters, and Nobunaga's death would provide the perfect opportunity for them to rebel against Oda rule, establish their own domains, or perhaps invite powerful neighboring clans like the Uesugi and the Hojo to claim a slice of the pie. To prevent this from happening, Ieyasu reached out to many former Takeda vassals, amongst them Yoda Nobushige in Seku, instructing him to gather as many troops and allies as possible. After gathering around 900 warriors, Nobushige occupied Komoro Castle. On June 29th, he sent Honda Nobutoshi to Kawajiri Hidetaka to secure his cooperation as well. Hidetaka was facing an uprising in his lands at the time, so Nobutoshi told him that Ieyasu was offering safe passage through his lands in case he wanted to retreat to Mino or Kyoto. This was an offer which probably offended Hidetaka, who recognized that Ieyasu was eyeing Oda territory. 4 days later, Hidetaka got Nobutoshi drunk and proceeded to murder him. Ieyasu would have probably exacted his revenge on the man, but fate had other plans. On the 7th of July, Hidetaka attempted to slip out of Kai with a small group of his retainers, but he was captured by the rebels and was put to death. By that time, Kai was not only host to rebels and Oda samurai, but also to Hojo troops. On the last day of June, Hojo Ujimasa, having learned of Nobunaga's death at the hands of Mitsuhide, mobilized his forces and marched to claim the former Takeda lands on the pretext of preventing a Tokugawa invasion. Within 3 days, they had captured Iwadono Castle in Kai and installed Watanabe Shozemon as lord of the area. At the same time, Sanada Masayuki, who was at that time in service to the Uesugi, attacked Numata Castle, which belonged to Kazumasu Takegawa's sphere of control. Kazumasu had already defended the castle when Fujita Nobuyoshi laid siege to the 4,000-strong garrison of Numata that was commanded by Kazumasu's nephew Takegawa Masushige. However, when Nobuyoshi had failed, Masayuki succeeded, and the castle was handed over to the Sanada. Troubles for Kazumasu were far from over, and 3 days later, Hojo Ieyasu and Ujinao had arrived at his doorstep with around 50,000 men. Kazumasu rallied his own 18,000 and met the Hojo army near the border between Kosuke and Musashi provinces at Kanegawa. In the first days of the conflict, the Takegawa forces enjoyed some success in minor skirmishes, managing to capture Kanekubo and Kawai castles. On the 8th, it was time for the big showdown. Once again, the battle began favorably for the Takegawa troops, as with only 3,000 men, Kazumasu was able to repel Ujinao's 20,000. Seeing this, Ujinori attempted to flank the Takegawa positions with his own 10,000-strong regiment. However, his subordinate generals moved without cohesion and became easy prey for Kazumasu, who charged their lines and turned them back. For a moment, it seemed that the Takegawa could have claimed victory at Kanegawa. However, Ujinao's men had recovered and regrouped, and, enjoying their vast numerical superiority, were able to annihilate Kazumasu's forces. As for the man himself, he managed to escape, and even secure safe passage from Masayuki, reaching Nagashima in Ise in the end. As we have already mentioned, the Hojo were not the only major power that wanted to take over the former Takeda clan. In the north, Uesugi Kage Katsu was also making plans of his own, and Masayuki had acted in his name, though it should be noted that Masayuki was mostly acting for his own interests. Prior to the Honnō-ji incident, Kage Katsu was in a very precarious position, facing invasions from 3 Oda generals, Shibata Katsuie, Mori Nagayoshi, and Kazumasu. But Nobunaga's death had forced his generals to call back their armies, and gave Kage Katsu the opportunity to muster his own troops and move south into northern Shinano. From there, Kage Katsu captured Kaizu Castle and attacked Fukashi, the seat of Kiso Yoshimasa, who was driven away and joined the Hojo forces. By that time, the Hojo had largely secured Kosuke province, with Hojo Ujikuni capturing Numata Castle and constructing another fortress near Iwabitsu to prevent Masayuki from moving to join Kage Katsu. On the 27th, Masayuki, pressed by the Hojo troops and having served Kage Katsu for 2 long weeks, decided to jump ship and defected to Ujimasa's side. As such, the Hojo forces headed northwest to prevent the Uesugi army from conquering the entirety of Shinano. Crossing the Usui Pass, Ujinao took Komoro Castle from Nobushige, who managed to escape and retreated to another defensive position. On the 2nd of August, the two sides met at Kawanakajima, the site where Takeda Shingen and Uesugi Kenshin had fought so many times in the past. This time, however, there would be no battle. After staring at each other menacingly, the Hojo army turned around and headed towards the south to meet Tokugawa Ieyasu, who had invaded Kai with a great force. Diplomacy would settle the differences between the Hojo and the Uesugi, as 2 weeks later they would reach a peace deal, by which Kagekatsu received 4 districts in northern Shinano and promised not to harass the Hojo while they fought Ieyasu. While Ieyasu was fighting for control of the former Takeda lands, the Oda clan had to deal with the succession crisis between Nobunaga's remaining sons. Nobunaga's generals were also daimyos and powerful men in their own right, and they too could seek a piece of the territory pie as well as leadership of the alliance. To settle these differences, one of Nobunaga's oldest and most trusted generals, Shibata Katsuie, called a conference at the castle of Kiyosu in Owari. Besides Nobunaga's sons, Nobukatsu and Nobutaka, and Katsuie himself, also present were Niue Nagahide, Ikeda Tsuneoki, and of course Hashiba Hideyoshi. Katsuie was quick to throw his support behind Nobutaka, who had been present at Yamazaki and avenged his father's death. For Hideyoshi to rise above Katsuie, he would have to support Nobukatsu's claim, but he was unlikely to win as his reputation was tarnished by military failures. This, compounded by his passiveness in the face of Ikechi's revolt, led many retainers to openly question his ability to lead. Nobutaka's election as the next head of the Oda clan seemed inevitable when Hideyoshi had an epiphany left the room and later returned holding in his hands the late Nobutada's infant son, Samboshi. Samboshi was the ideal candidate. He was the son of Nobutada, Nobunaga's chosen heir, and his other grandfather was Takeda Shingen, thus combining two of Japan's biggest names. More importantly, he was 3 years old, and therefore not an immediate problem to the powerful Oda vassals. One by one, the Oda generals supported Hideyoshi's proposal. The land between the 4 powerful vassals was also equally divided, with the exception of Nobunaga's personal fiefs that went to his sons. Hideyoshi was awarded Yamashiro, Kawachi and Tamba, while Katsuie received Omi and Echizen. Kyoto, despite being in the province of Yamashiro, was decided to be jointly ruled by all 4 in equal measure, though Hideyoshi showed more interest in the city and practically exercised greater authority. Ieyasu had thus far tried to win to his side as many of the former Takeda vassals as possible, and his generals had been involved in some small skirmishes. Now, having received the green light from Hideyoshi at the Kyosu conference, he marched with the goal of properly subjugating these provinces and adding them to his own domain. At the head of 8,000 men, Ieyasu himself marched straight into Kai, while another column, led by Sakai Tadetsugu and Ogasawara Nobumine, marched to Shinano. Tadetsugu's efforts were met with little success, as they faced stiff resistance from Suwa Yoritada, who held Takeshima Castle long enough for Ujinao to come to his rescue. Seeing the vastly larger Hojo force, which numbered more than 40,000 men, Tadetsugu's own 3,000 soldiers turned tail. They fled towards Shimpu Castle in Kai, which had already been occupied by Ieyasu's detachment. The pursuing Hojo forces were unable to destroy any fleeing Tokugawa warriors thanks to the excellent rearguard action of a samurai named Okabe Masatsuna, but nonetheless they also entered Kai and set up their camp at Wakimiko. So it was that in early September, the two sides faced off in numerous skirmishes around the areas of Shinpu and Nomi castles, where the Tokugawa men had set up their defensive lines and constructed additional defenses. Despite outnumbering their opponents more than 5 to 1, the Hojo were unable to dislodge the defenders. Hoping to break the stalemate, Ujinao sent Ujitada and Ujikatsu with 10,000 men to make their way around Kurakoma village and attack Ieyasu's position from the rear. However, they were met by Tori Mototada, who anticipated such a maneuver. While his regiment only numbered 2,000 men, Mototada was able to soundly defeat the larger Hojo force, killing about 300 of them. The defeat at Kurakoma and the overall stalemate at Shimpu became the turning point for Ieyasu's campaign, which had not fared that well up to that point. Their inability to beat their much smaller adversary shook the Hojo army's prestige, and one by one, many of their allies switched to the Tokugawa side, feeling it was the safer option to bet on. Amongst them was Kiso Yoshimasa, Yoda Nobushige, and most importantly, Sanada Masayuki, who seemed to switch allegiances faster than the speed of light. To be fair, he had bent the knee to the Hojo because they had parked an army outside his walls. Furthermore, his goal from the very start was to acquire Numata Castle, a natural stronghold that stood on the roads connecting 3 provinces. However, the Hojo also considered it theirs by right, and would never willingly relinquish it to him. So when Ieyasu approached him, he was more than happy to switch sides, and immediately went and recaptured Numata. The Hojo tried to reclaim the castle, but they were unable to do so. In the meantime, Yoda Nobushige had managed to reclaim Komoro Castle, and Uchiyama captured Usui Pass, before helping Masayuki block any supplies and reinforcements from making their way to Ujinao's army. The Tokugawa side was also victorious in southern Shinano, where Ogasawara Sadayoshi took Fakashi Castle with Kiso Yoshimasa, ousting Ogasawara Dosetsusai, who controlled it for the Uesugi. With the Tokugawa forces steadily claiming ground and courting clans from the northeast of the Kanto Plain, and with their supply lines cut off, the Hojo had no option but to seek a peace deal with Ieyasu. At the ensuing conference, Toyotomi Hideyoshi and Nobunaga's second son, Oda Nobukatsu, acted as the mediators between the two warring clans. On the 24th of November, the two sides signed a treaty that awarded Ieyasu with the provinces of Shinano and Kai, while the Hojo would keep Kosuke, with Numata Castle returned to them. Moreover, both sides would promise not to meddle in each other's affairs. In addition, Ujinao would marry Ieyasu's second daughter, Tokuhime, thus establishing familial ties between the two clans. Thus, the conflict between the Hojo and the Tokugawa was brought to a satisfying end for the two sides. Ieyasu would continue fighting some minor independent lords who continued to resist him in Shinano, but he was otherwise in control of the provinces. However, there was a man who was not satisfied at all with the current peace treaty, and, upon reviewing the terms, it is not hard to guess who that man was. That's right, Sanada Masayuki, who was less than thrilled at having to give his hard-earned nomadic castle back to the Hojo. Choosing not to comply with the terms the Tokugawa and the Hojo had agreed upon, he instead began constructing a new stronghold, Ueda Castle, and prepared to go to war with them. It wouldn't be long before the rivalry between Katsuie and Hideyoshi would lead to open hostility. Oda Nobunaga quite understandably couldn't accept the fate that a baby had beaten him for the clan's leadership, and still sought to reclaim his stolen position. Shibata had supported him in the past, and their alliance was solidified through the marriage of Katsuie to his aunt Lady Uichi, the widow of Azai Nagamasa. Shibata Katsuie wasn't the only one who thought that Hideyoshi was planning to usurp the power of the Oda clan, and around him gathered many other generals who thought Nobunaga to be the rightful heir, like Takigawa Kazemasu and Maeda Toshie. The Oda-Shibata alliance would have been an incredibly hard obstacle for Hideyoshi to overcome had Nobunaga not given an unexpected gift to his enemy when he declared war in late 1582. The timing couldn't have been worse, as the winter snows had blocked the northern roads, trapping Katsuie and the bulk of his army in Echizen. A very grateful Hideyoshi marched quickly to Nobunaga's seat of power in Gifu and forced him to swear fealty. While returning to Kyoto, he was informed that Takigawa Kazemasu and Shibata Katsutoyo, Katsuie's son, had both raised their armies and were planning a two-pronged attack. Hideyoshi first moved against Katsutoyo in Nagahama, and after subduing the castle's defenders through bribery, moved against Kazemasu in Kameyama, which he captured after successfully using mines to blow up a section of the walls. As spring was approaching, the snow that thus far had kept Katsuie in Echizen would melt, and so Hideyoshi moved his forces to northern Omi once more, where he constructed a series of fortifications in anticipation of the arrival of his enemy. And so it happened, as Shibata Katsuie, at the head of his 20,000-strong army, marched south and stopped before Hashiba's defensive line. Everything had gone according to plan, or so Hideyoshi thought, but as soon as his forces reached Kinomoto, he was informed that Oda Nobunaga had once again gathered his troops. Nobunaga's army posed a serious threat to Hideyoshi's rear, and if he wanted victory, he would have to move quickly. Leaving behind his half-brother, Hashiba Hidenaga, with 15,000 men, and Niue Nagahide as the head of another 2, he raced towards Gifu once more. But cleverly thinking that his presence might be needed, he set up his headquarters at Ogaki, leaving Nobunaga's other son, Nobukatsu, to command the siege. Meanwhile, noticing the absence of half of the Hashiba troops, Katsuie began besieging the castles. He sent a detachment led by Sakuma Morimasa around Lake Yogo to attack the fortresses from the southwestern approach, while a regiment under Maeda Toshie provided cover against a possible counterattack. He was thus able to capture the castles of Oiwa and Iwasaki, which were defended by Nakagawa Kiyahide and Takeyama Ukon respectively. Kiyahide was killed, but Ukon managed to escape. Only the castle of Shizugatake remained under Hashiba control, and Morimasa was determined to change that. Ignoring Hidetaka's army and orders from Katsuie to abandon the offensive operations and instead fortify the captured Oiwa castle, he pressed on. When Hideyoshi at Ogaki was informed that Morimasa was besieging Shizugatake, instead of seeking refuge inside Oiwa, he famously proclaimed, "Then I have won." The following day, he took his cavalry forces to quickly head back to Kinomoto, his infantry marching behind at a far slower pace. He stopped only to assume command of Hidenaga's troops, and to be briefed on the situation at hand. Then Hideyoshi blew on a conch shell. It was the signal his men were waiting for, and like hungry wolves, they fell on Sakuma's lines. As the sun was slowly rising behind the mountain peaks, the two forces clashed. Due to the mountainous nature of the terrain, battle lines soon dissolved, a frenzied melee and personal duels taking their place. Amidst this chaos, individual combat skills would determine the outcome of the battle, and Hideyoshi's elite horse guards proved pivotal. 7 of these men, most notably Kato Kiyomasa and Fukushima Masanori, exemplified themselves, earning the nickname the 7 Spears of Shizugatake. Meanwhile, Maeda Toshie, who was observing the events, realized Hideyoshi's army would emerge victorious and decided to retreat to Fuchu Castle, later coming to terms with the victorious Hashiba. The force of the attackers, coupled with the abandonment by their allies, finally broke Sakuma's troops, who hurled down their weapons and armor and ran to the valley. Shibata Katsuie, despite seeing them routing, initially wanted to make a stand, but was persuaded by his advisors and ordered a general retreat towards the safety of Kitanosho Castle, with Hideyoshi pursuing him and laying siege to the fortress. Katsuie, coming to terms with the fact that it was all over, decided to go out as a samurai. It is said that he climbed to the 9th floor of the keep and announced to his men his decision to die by his own hand. He then ordered the keep to be set ablaze, and amidst the flames, Katsuie and his wife, Uichi, committed suicide. Following the fall of the castle, her daughters came under Hideyoshi's protection, who promptly sent them to Osaka, where he was building a new and imposing castle over the ruins of the old Ishiyama Hongan-ji. In a weird twist of fate, the eldest of Uichi's daughters, Yododono, also known as Lady Chacha, became his wife and mother to his heir Hideyori, while the youngest would marry Tokugawa Hidetada, the second shogun. Katsuie's death pretty much signaled the end of the war. Maeda Toshie had already shown his unwillingness to confront Hideyoshi head-on, and now officially submitted to him, while Takegawa Kazemasu bent the knee a few months later. But what about Oda Nobunaga? Besieged at Gifu by his brother, he was ultimately forced to surrender once more, but this time Hideyoshi's capacity for forgiveness had reached its limits. Neither would Nobukatsu show any mercy to a brother whom he considered to be an obstacle on his path to ascension. Confined at a monastery in Owari, he was pressured into committing seppuku 2 months later, leaving behind a rather bitter death poem wishing for the gods to punish Hideyoshi. However, Nobunaga's death did not bring an end to the infighting of the Oda camp. Nobukatsu was now rid of his rival sibling, and all that remained between him and the kingdom his father had carved was 3-year-old Samboshi, backed by the Hashiba clan. Therefore, Nobukatsu would need an equally strong ally to oppose Hideyoshi. His search did not take long, as he found that partner in the face of Tokugawa Ieyasu. Ieyasu had perceptively remained on the sideline during the Hashiba-Shibata conflict, instead focusing on securing the former possessions of the Takeda clan in Kai and Shinano provinces. His military might and ambition matched Hideyoshi's, and with Nobukatsu on his side, he now had a pretext to advance against him. Following his victory at Shizugatake, Hideyoshi returned to Osaka to oversee the final touches upon his magnificent new residence. With this new castle completed, Hideyoshi extended invitations to various high-ranking samurai generals and lords, like Chosokabe Motochika, Kobayakawa Takakage, and the late dictator's son Oda Nobukatsu, to visit him. These, however, were not merely friendly social calls. At first glance, Hideyoshi's invitations looked like a nice, friendly move to celebrate a great victory, but it was nothing less than Hideyoshi asking for homage. In the case of Nobukatsu, it also meant the reversal of the master-vassal relationship between them. The Oda lord would have to pledge allegiance to his former Ashigaru, an idea that Nobukatsu could not entertain in the slightest. Nobukatsu naturally declined the invitation, which led to the two men falling out. Seeking to alienate Nobukatsu from his closest supporters, Hideyoshi extended grace to 3 of Nobukatsu's chief retainers, Sugawa Yoshifuyu, Okada Shigitaka, and Azai Nagatoki. However, Nobukatsu caught wind of the relations between the 3 men and Hideyoshi, and promptly had them recalled to his castle and executed. Suspicious of his longtime allies, and lacking the strength to confront Hideyoshi alone, the Oda lord then turned to Tokugawa Ieyasu for help. Ieyasu, who had been a cautious man all his life, knew that facing Hideyoshi was madness. Still, Nobukatsu's plea presented a perfect excuse for war with Hideyoshi, and if he played his cards right, he could become the absolute authority in the land. Hideyoshi tried in vain to bribe Ieyasu by offering lordship over the provinces of Mino and Owari, but the Tokugawa daimyo declined. All-out war between the two men was now inevitable. Ieyasu moved quickly, trying to bring to his camp those former retainers of Nobunaga who now stood on the fence. He called for Sasa Narimasa of Echu province to attack Hideyoshi's steadfast ally and one of the 4 Karo, Niwa Nagahide, who governed Kaga and Echizen provinces. He also invited Chosokabe Motochika, ruler of all Shikoku, to hit Hideyoshi from across the sea in his exposed soft underbelly. Finally, he asked various warrior monk sects to lend him their strength. Nobukatsu, meanwhile, reached out to Ikeda Tsuneyoki, the other Karo, whose family had served the Oda clan for generations, even releasing Tsuneyoki's hostage son as a sign of good faith. However, Tsuneyoki owed a great deal to Hideyoshi and was thus conflicted as to which side to pick. When a messenger from Osaka arrived bearing the words of Hideyoshi that promised to make Tsuneyoki the lord of Mino and Owari, the latter wholeheartedly threw his lot in with the Toyotomi. Furthermore, Hideyoshi secured the support of Uesugi Kagekatsu, whose position threatened the rear of Ieyasu's ally Sasa Narimasa should he make a move. Others that stood behind Toyotomi's Golden Gourd banner were various lords of Ise and Iga provinces, Bizen, Mimisaka, and Tengo. In Ise and Owari, Nobukatsu had made the first moves by securing the castles of the retainers he had executed and then capturing Kamiyama on the 22nd of April. The very next day, Hideyoshi's generals tried in vain to reclaim it by launching a frontal assault, so they settled in for a siege while at the same time attacking Mine Castle, which would fall just 2 days later. Meanwhile, Ieyasu's forces marched from Mikawa to meet up with Nobukatsu's forces in Kyosu Castle on the 23rd. However, Hideyoshi's allies in the area had already made a move as Ikeda Tsuneyoki captured the nearby castle of Inuyama. Inuyama nominally belonged to Nobukatsu and was governed by Nakagawa Sadanari, who had chosen a really bad time to be absent at Ise. Taking advantage of Sadanari's absence, Tsuneyoki's men marched from Okaki Castle and laid a brief siege at Inuyama. Tsuneyoki, who had served as castellan of the place during Nobunaga's time, was familiar with the castle's defenses. Moreover, when some of the defenders recognized their old commander, they assisted him in breaching the castle walls and capturing the main keep. Following the capture of Inuyama, Mori Nagayoshi moved towards Hogoru Castle with 3,000 men. He was a well-connected commander, being Tsuneyoki's son-in-law, a brother to Ranmaru, and having served as Nobunaga's page during the events of Honnō-ji. However, Ieyasu was prepared for him. Having anticipated such a movement, the Tokugawa lord had already left Kyosu. He set up camp at Koyakiyama, a hill that would grant him a significant tactical advantage in the coming battle. At dawn, Ieyasu's generals, Matsudaira Ietada and Okudaira Nobumasa, launched an attack at Nagayoshi's headquarters at Hachimanbayashi, with heavy arquebus fire being exchanged between the two sides before the melee clash. At the same time, after being granted permission by his overlord, Sakai Tadatsugu made a wide flanking maneuver and attacked Nagayoshi's forces in the rear, inflicting terrible losses. However, the Mori general managed to break through the encirclement and escape. An attempt to change the outcome from Tsuneyoki was made by dispatching reinforcements to Hogaru. But Ieyasu met those troops by relocating his own. The leader of the Ikeda regiment, Inaba Itetsu, preferred to avoid combat and didn't commit, so Ieyasu also pulled back to reinforce and fortify his position at Komakiyama. Ieyasu's men began repairing the half-destroyed castle that was built during Nobunaga's time, as well as the nearby Hira and Kobata castles. They also dug trenches and other earthworks and constructed a long palisade wall that stretched about half a mile from Komakiyama to Hachimanzuka. While Ieyasu was building up his defenses at Komakiyama, Toyotomi Hideyoshi decided to personally enter the stage, leaving Sakamoto Castle for Gifu with 25,000 men before proceeding on to Inuyama, which he reached on the 7th of May. There, Hideyoshi was educated on the tactical situation on the front, which he later assessed for himself by overlooking Ieyasu's fortifications from some hills. Despite the Toyotomi alliance having a massive numerical advantage over Ieyasu, as the combined strength of their armies more than doubled that of the Tokugawa camp, Hideyoshi decided that the Tokugawa defenses were too strong to risk a direct assault, and opted to build his own line of fortifications linking 3 forts with a rampart that stretched over 2 kilometers long and 4 meters high. He then set up his headquarters at Gakuden and waited for Ieyasu to make a move. But on the other side of the 2 fence lines, the Tokugawa lord had the same idea, and was waiting for Hideyoshi to come at him, knowing the defender would enjoy a significant advantage in the upcoming battle. And so the 2 sides waited for each other, with neither army emerging to challenge the other. This continued until, seemingly out of boredom, Ikeda Tsuneyoki suggested raiding Mikawa province, the home province of the Tokugawa clan, to force Ieyasu to abandon his fortified position. Even if Ieyasu didn't leave Komiyakama entirely, he would surely have to send part of his army back to Mikawa, thus weakening his defenses substantially enough for Hideyoshi to attempt to overwhelm them with a frontal assault. Hideyoshi gave his permission. Thus, Ikeda Tsuneyoki embarked with his son-in-law, Mori Nagayoshi, as well as Hori Hidemasa and Hideyoshi's nephew, Miyoshi Hidesugu. Under cover of darkness, and with around 20,000 men under their combined command, they left the Toyotomi camp on the 15th of May, and after crossing the Shonai and Yada rivers, they arrived at the area of Nagakute 3 days later, where they came face to face with their first obstacle, the castle of Iwasaki. The castle was commanded by Niwa Ujishige, who had no more than 240 men to garrison its defenses and could not hope to resist the enemy force. Yet Ujishige would not go down without a fight, hoping to at least delay the Toyotomi forces enough for a messenger to reach Ieyasu and warn him of the invading force that had penetrated so deep into his defensive lines. Despite Ujishige's valiant efforts, Tsuneyoki's raiding force achieved a quick victory and continued on. However, the sounds of the battle alarmed the local peasants, who hurried to inform Lord Tokugawa. While Ieyasu was at first reluctant to believe the words of the farmers, reports of his own scout that confirmed Tsuneyoki's flanking maneuver convinced him to take action. Thus, Ieyasu left Sakai Tadatsugu, Ishikawa Kazumasa, and Honda Tadakatsu with 5,000 men at Komaki to deter any move on Hideyoshi's part. Ieyasu himself took 11,000 men, including Sakakibara Yasumasa, Ii Naomasa, and Oda Nobukatsu, and made his way to Kashiwai. Ahead of the main force marched his uncle, Mizuno Tadashige, at the head of the vanguard consisting of around 4,500 soldiers, with orders to halt down the enemy if they engaged in battle or to pursue them further into Mikawa. After reaching Kobata, Tadashige continued to attack Hidetsugu's rear, while Yasumasa followed a different route, essentially forming a pincer move that not only enveloped Hidetsugu's forces, but also caught them completely by surprise while the soldiers were taking their breakfast. Miyoshi's forces were routed from the battlefield, with Hideyoshi's nephew himself barely managing to escape the ensuing onslaught. The sound of the battle alarmed Hori Hidemasa's nearby troops upon the arrival of the Tokugawa armies. Hidemasa rallied his 3,000 men to come to Hidetsugu's rescue, but it was already too late. Therefore, he chose to position his regiment on a hill that overlooked the Kanare River near the village of Nagakute. There he prepared for the oncoming Tokugawa forces, offering 100 koku to any man who would shoot down a cavalryman. Soon enough, Sakakibara's troops came marching towards them, fresh from their victory over Miyoshi's division. They confidently attacked Hidemasa's position, but they were met with a devastating hailstorm of arrows and arquebus fire that broke their charge. The Hori forces then counterattacked and completely broke the morale of Sakakibara's men, who fell back and only recovered when they saw Ieyasu's own golden fan banner approaching. But Ieyasu wasn't the only one joining the battle. By that time, news of their detection by their enemy had reached the ears of Ikeda Tsuneyoki and Mori Nagayoshi, who turned around their divisions to join Hori Hidemasa's forces at Nagakute. Tsuneyoki's two sons, Terimasa and Motosuke, positioned their forces on the right wing, with their father staying behind in the reserve, while Nagayoshi secured the left flank. Opposite him, on the right wing of his own line, stood Tokugawa Ieyasu himself, while Ii Naomasa and his Red Demons were guarding the left flank, and Oda Nobukatsu remained in the reserves. The battle started with the arquebusiers of both sides exchanging heavy fire, which inflicted significant casualties on Ikeda's men, and prompted his sons on the right flank to launch a head-on attack against Naomasa's men. However, the Red Demons proved more than a match for them, and were able to repel several assaults even when they were reinforced with forces drawn from Ikeda's center. Seeing the center of Ikeda's formation weakening, Ieyasu, who by that point had not yet moved, advanced on Nagayoshi's troops from the right flank. The two forces clashed fiercely, and in the ensuing combat, Nagayoshi lost his life to one of Tokugawa's arquebusiers, who was able to spot him due to his distinct armor. With Ikeda's left wing firmly tied by Ieyasu's own men, Nobukatsu, who was still sitting in the reserve, made a wide flanking maneuver and fell upon Tsuneyoki's regiment. In the frenzied melee, the Ikeda Daimyo followed his son-in-law to the grave by the hands of a samurai named Nagai Denpachiro. His death caused a massive loss of morale to his troops, who began routing en masse. In the slaughter that followed, Tsuneyoki's eldest son, Motosuke, also perished. Soon enough, news of the battle reached Hideyoshi's ears at Inuyama, and he made haste with a large host to reinforce his generals at Nagakute. Seeing the Toyotomi's defenses weaken from their own fortifications at Komaki, Ieyasu's generals held a gathering, but could not agree on a common course of action. Sakai Tadatsugu supported a direct attack on the Toyotomi positions, which Ishikawa Kazumasa vehemently opposed. At the same time, Honda Tadakatsu refused to sit idle. Leaping into action, he gathered a regiment of around 1,000 samurai and set off to attack Hideyoshi's rear. He was, however, unable to find an opening, and luckily for him, Hideyoshi preferred to continue marching instead of engaging Tadakatsu's force. Even so, the Toyotomi reinforcements arrived at Kobata too late to change the outcome of the battle, and Ieyasu was already safe inside the castle. Another stalemate like the one at Komaki played out, with both sides staring menacingly at each other behind their respective palisades. After 3 weeks, Hideyoshi finally lost his patience and withdrew completely, leaving only a small garrison force around Inuyama Castle. Ieyasu too, despite having achieved a victory on the battlefield, decided to return to Okazaki. However, the absence of the Tokugawa soldiers from the front lines gave Hideyoshi essentially a blank check to do as he pleased with the other member of the Oda Tokugawa alliance, Nobukatsu. Thus, the Toyotomi armies went on the offensive, immediately besieging and capturing Kaganoi Castle to the northwest of Kyosu. Following that, Hideyoshi attacked the castle at Takegahara, which he captured after a month-long siege, during which he diverted the flow of the Kiso River in a move that echoed his previous triumph at Takematsu. Oku was next in line, and after that, Hideyoshi proceeded to return back to his home in Osaka, leaving behind his generals to continue their attacks on Nobukatsu's strongholds, who was safe inside his headquarters at Nagashino, but also unable to stop the rampaging Toyotomi troops. The epilogue to the campaign came when Hideyoshi's general, Takegawa Kazumatsu, successfully convinced his cousin, Maeda Tanetoshi, to surrender the castle of Kanie, which lay halfway between Kyosu and Nagashino, and posed a substantial threat to Nobukatsu's position. The fall of Kanie also led to the capture of the nearby and smaller Taba Castle. Kazumatsu's spree continued with the attempted conquest of Ono, but this was unsuccessful. Wary of the threat the Toyotomi forces posed, Nobukatsu appealed for help to Ieyasu, who dispatched Sakakibara Yasumasa to relieve his ailing ally. Kanie and the surrounding castles soon came under siege by the combined Tokugawa and Oda forces, which were led by Nobukatsu's uncle Oda Nobunaga. On the 23rd of June, after an exhausting siege, Kazumatsu was able to strike a deal with the besiegers, who agreed to let the garrison go unharmed in exchange for his cousin's head. And so poor Tanetoshi paid the price for betraying his lord, and with his head, Kanie returned to Oda control. This was the final action of the Komaki-Nagakute campaign, as Hideyoshi, upon seeing the reversal of the situation on the field, resorted to diplomacy. As castles and lands changed hands, and as each side exchanged hostages, an uneasy peace was concluded. Ieyasu had prevailed on the battlefield, and on the tactical level he was victorious. Yet his wins had not been translated into gaining him anything on the strategic level. If anything, Hideyoshi had emerged more powerful, as his hegemony continued to solidify, and with Ieyasu out of the picture, he was now free to pursue other goals and further conquests, such as the destruction of the Ikkō-ikki at Nagoro-ji, the pacification of Sasanarimasa in Echu, and the subjugation of Shikoku and Kyushu islands. In the following year, Hideyoshi used his advantageous position to firmly establish himself as the hegemon of Japan. With no one left in the Oda camp to challenge his authority, he soon reversed the vassal-master relationship that had thus far existed between the Hashiba and the Oda clans by granting a few fiefs of land to Oda Nobukatsu and Shamboshi. Wasting little time, his armies soon took to the field again, and in the spring of 1585, Hideyoshi's troops marched against the warrior monks of the Saike-ikki of Ki province, who had fortified themselves at Nagoro-ji. The Sohei were skilled warriors, especially those of the Saige-ikki, who had a long tradition of manufacturing firearms and had been among those who supplied guns to Ishiyama Hongan-ji. In short, they were not an enemy to be trifled with. Moving into Izumi province, Hideyoshi's forces faced their first obstacles, a series of castles, namely Sawa, Shakuzen, Hatanaka and Sengoku-bori, which were defended by roughly 9,000 men. Sengoku-bori in particular, which laid on the easternmost flank of the line, would prove a tough nut to crack. On the 21st of March, the castle's defenders sallied out, under the leadership of Otani Sadahito and attacked the Toyotomi forces who were under the overall command of Hideyoshi's nephew Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Catching them completely by surprise, they managed to inflict a great number of casualties before retreating back inside the castle to fend off the Toyotomi counterattack by the skillful use of firearms and bows. The fighting prowess of Sengoku Bori's 1,500 defenders cannot be overstated, and perhaps they could have defeated the Toyotomi host had not tragedy struck. As the battle around the castle was raging on, a fire arrow, shot by Tsutsui Sadatsugu's archers, managed to strike the gunpowder magazine, igniting it and causing a massive explosion which led to the castle's surrender. Hideyoshi's soldiers spared none of the defenders, not even the animals, and burned the fortress to the ground. After the fall of Sengoku Bori, the rest of the other outposts followed suit. That same night, the defenders of Hatanaka abandoned their castle and withdrew after putting their castle to the torch. On the same evening, fights began around Shakuzenji and Sawa castles. Just as in Sengoku Bori, their defenders offered stiff resistance with guns and bows. Yet, facing the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Toyotomi forces, they were ultimately forced to surrender the day after. Having captured the 4 outposts in Izumi province, Hideyoshi's army moved into Ki and laid siege to Nagoro-ji. The temple complex had been mostly abandoned by that point, and despite any resistance the remaining defenders put up, the temple fell to Hideyoshi's men after just a 2-day siege. In a move reminiscent of Nobunaga's burning of Mount Hiei and in Ryakuji, Hideyoshi had Nagoro-ji put to the torch. However, different sources give alternative explanations to the fire that engulfed the temple, attributing it to its defenders or some negligent soldiers. In any case, Hideyoshi would bring fire upon his enemies as he invaded the Saige-ikki's lands, while burning villages and temples as he went. In the process, he destroyed the confederation that in the past had defied even Nobunaga. Despite Hideyoshi's overwhelming force, remnants of the Saige-ikki continued to resist in various places, with their most important bastion and stage of the ultimate showdown being Ota Castle, seat of Ota Sakon. While the location of the castle and its construction rendered any attack by fire ineffective, they offered a great opportunity for another of Hideyoshi's signature moves, flooding. Having surrounded the Ota on all sides, Hideyoshi ordered Norizane Akeshi to construct a dike and a dam on the nearby Kinukawa River to alter its course and flood the castle. The construction of the embankment proved rather difficult, as it was twice destroyed, with the second incident leading to the death of many Toyotomi troops. Overcoming these setbacks, Hideyoshi continued the siege, and as the water continued to rise and their supplies diminished, the defenders of Ota, after resisting for more than 20 days, finally surrendered. Hideyoshi would show no mercy. Those of samurai status were put to the sword, some even crucified, while many preferred to take their own lives to escape Hideyoshi's wrath. Interestingly enough, his vengeance was not extended to the common foot soldiers and the peasants that had sought refuge inside the castle, perhaps due to the memory of his own humble beginnings. Whatever the case, Hideyoshi let them go unharmed and bade them return to their fields, albeit not without confiscating their weapons first. The fall of Ota concluded Toyotomi's conquest of Ki. While some settlements continued to resist, none could threaten his control of the province. Hideyoshi was now free to turn his attention against his second target, which conveniently lay just across the sea, the island of Shikoku. The smallest of the main Japanese islands, Shikoku was at that time ruled primarily by Chosokabe Motochika, though areas that defied his authority existed as well. Hideyoshi was not the first to have contemplated invading the island. 3 years prior, his then overlord, Oda Nobunaga, had made preparations and had amassed an army of 14,000 men under his son Nobutaka for that purpose. However, Nobunaga's untimely end forestalled the invasion plans. Now it was Hideyoshi's time to try. By June of the same year, the Toyotomi forces were ready to invade the island and exact revenge from Motochika, who in the previous year had made the mistake of siding with Tokugawa Ieyasu. For the first time, Hideyoshi did not lead his troops personally, but instead delegated the task to his subordinate generals. He would join the scene in the last moments to claim the glory. Just as the invading force was making preparations for a medieval-style D-Day, so was Chosokabe Motochika preparing to defend his territory, which he had painstakingly conquered over 25 years. He gathered a force of roughly 40,000 men, which he deployed in various strategic points across the island, where they repaired old castles and constructed new defences. The majority of his troops and best commanders were stationed in Awa province, correctly predicting the main invasion's route. Indeed, in mid-June, 60,000 men, under Toyotomi Hidenaga and Toyotomi Hidetsugu, crossed over from Awaji Island and into Awa. However, Hideyoshi had planned a three-pronged invasion, with another group of roughly 23,000 men sailing from Bizen and landing at Senuki, and a third division of more than 30,000 soldiers crossing from Aki to Iyo province. Landing at Yashina in Sanuki province, the smaller of the three regiments swiftly captured Kyoka, Kosai and Murei castles and prepared to siege Ueda. However, upon witnessing the fortress's strong defences and fearing an encirclement from a Chosokabe relief force, they decided to lift the siege and, heeding Kuroda Kanbei's advice, made their way towards Awa to link up with the main force. Perhaps Kanbei had, through spies or scouts, possessed knowledge of Motochika's plans. Alternatively, it is possible that, being the great strategist that he was, he had correctly assessed the situation, for the Chosokabe daimyo had indeed placed a force nearby to ambush the would-be besiegers. After merging together, the two detachments moved to besiege Kizu Castle, which fell into their hands after just 8 days. Unobstructed, Hideyoshi's troops captured Ushiki and Kiyama castles without a fight, and from then on, Hidenaga proceeded to siege Ichinomiya, while Hidetsugu moved to Iwakura, accompanied by Kuroda Kanbei. A few days later, following an intense bombardment, Hideyoshi's banners flew over the castle. Its surrender also led to the abandonment of the nearby Waki Castle, and towards late July, the fall of Ichinomiya concluded Hideyoshi's conquest of Awa. At the same time, the 3rd Regiment, which consisted mostly of Mori troops and led by Kobayakawa Takakage and Kikawa Motoharu, had sailed from Aki and landed at Iyo. Wasting no time, they moved against Takao and Kaneko castles, the seats of the Ishikawa and Kaneko families respectively. The head of the latter, Kaneko Motoye, led the overall military command of the area, and was determined to put up fierce resistance to honor his service to Motochika, despite his clan being close to the Mori thanks to their intermediates in Shikoku, the Kono clan. Leaving the defense of Kaneko to his younger brother, coincidentally also named Motoharu, he barricaded his forces in Takao. After a fierce fight, Kaneko fell, and Takakage surrounded Takao with his men on the 12th of July, beginning their bloody assaults on the castle walls. 5 days later, with half of the fortress already destroyed and with no hope of achieving victory, Motoye set fire to the castle and, with his remaining 800 men, sallied out to meet a heroic death. Following the capture of Takao, the Mori troops continued the conquest of Iyo, which wasn't concluded until late August. Yet Motochika had already surrendered. Following the decisive blow that was the fall of Ichinomiya Castle, the head of the Chosokabe clan officially surrendered to Hideyoshi on the 6th of August. The conquest of Shikoku, something that had taken Motochika a lifetime to accomplish, had been achieved by Hideyoshi in 1 month. The Toyotomi daimyo was magnanimous in his victory, and while he naturally stripped away most of Motochika's conquests to reward his loyal vassals, he allowed the Chosokabe to retain control of Tosa province. That same month, Hideyoshi officially became the most powerful man in the land, as he was given the title of Kanpaku, chief advisor and regent to the emperor, a title that for centuries was monopolized by the Fujiwara clan and their cadet branches. In fact, after Hideyoshi's successor, Hidetsugu, the title returned to Fujiwara hands until its abolishment during the Meiji Restoration, making the two the only non-Fujiwaras to have held the office. Along with that came the family name Toyotomi. Up to that point, the clan's name was officially Hashiba. What Hideyoshi had achieved could be said to be impossible. He had risen from humble origins, and now he had become a member of the old nobility, surpassing even the samurai class as a whole. He was second nominally only to the emperor, but since the latter lacked any real power, Hideyoshi was the true master of Japan. However, there were still loose ends to tie up, and fancy titles given by the imperial court would not bring to heel the daimyo who only recognized the authority of the blade. So Hideyoshi personally took command of his army and marched to Echu province, controlled by Sasa Narimasa, who was still in open rebellion following the Battle of Kameki and Nagakute. The Kanpaku's 100,000-strong force was not a match for Narimasa's troops, who were outnumbered 5-1. After a brief siege at Toyama, he surrendered. Ever gracious in victory, Hideyoshi allowed him to live, but stripped him of his territory, which he gave to Maeda Toshie. Narimasa would be relocated in 1587 to a small fief in Higo province on the island of Kyushu following its conquest. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because in 1585 the Tokugawa clan was once again at war. Sanada Masayuki was refusing to hand over Numata to the Hojo, and Ujimasa was asking Ieyasu to force his vassal to act on the terms of the peace deal. In June of that year, Ieyasu advanced with his army into Kai to show Masayuki he meant business. But this only served to strengthen the latter's resolve, who decided to break his ties with the Tokugawa and once more side with the Uesugi. To that end, Masayuki sent his second son Yukimura as hostage to the Uesugi. Of course, Masayuki's defiance could not go unpunished, so Ieyasu sent Tori Mototada, Okubo Tadio, and Hiraiwa Chikayoshi with 7,000 men to capture Ueda Castle, where Masayuki had transferred his seat, and was waiting with around 1,200 men. His eldest son, Nobuyuki, was put in charge of defending the nearby Toshi Castle. Knowing that his numerical strength wasn't enough to oppose Ieyasu's troops, since Ueda had not been finished yet, Masayuki asked Uesugi Kagekatsu for assistance. However, Kagekatsu was otherwise occupied at that moment, assisting Hideyoshi with suppressing Sasa Narimasa in Echu. Consequently, he sent only a fragment of his forces, which still nevertheless posed a threat to the Tokugawa side. In addition, Masayuki ordered the construction of various traps and obstacles in the castle, and told his men to lure the Tokugawa soldiers inside Ueda. Thus, when the Tokugawa army assaulted the castle, it all went according to Masayuki's plan. Mototada's men were easily able to push past the first line of defences and make it to the second bailey. It was then that the trap was sprung, and Masayuki's men counterattacked, while archers and arquebusiers unleashed devastating volleys. A fierce battle began, and with casualties mounting, the Tokugawa forces were slowly pushed back. However, the various obstacles and traps the Sanada had placed made their retreat difficult. At that time, Masayuki signaled to his son Nobuyuki to attack, and he assaulted the Tokugawa force on their flank, completely breaking their morale. Mototada's men were routed, leaving behind 1,300 dead, many of them drowned in the Kamikawa River. In the opposite camp, the victorious Sanada is said to have suffered only 40 casualties. The following day, the Tokugawa force attacked Mariko Castle, an underlying fortress in the area, but once again they failed. A similar fate faced a Hojo attack on Numata Castle, which Masayuki's uncle, Yawaza Noritsuna, defended. Soon after, Kagekatsu's forces arrived in the area and began skirmishing with the Tokugawa. Seeing that the situation had turned for the worse, Ieyasu ordered a temporary retreat of his troops to regroup and reorganize, even holding back a 5,000-strong regiment led by Ii Naomasa that was underway to reinforce Mototada's army. But there would be no renewed assault on Sanada's positions, as one of Ieyasu's most loyal and important vassals up to that time, Ishikawa Kazumasa, defected to the Toyotomi, which forced Ieyasu to rethink his position. Perhaps fearing another attack from Hideyoshi, he decided to abandon the campaign against the Sanada altogether. Masayuki's great victory at Ueda established him as a great tactician among the warriors of Japan. It earned him the respect of Ieyasu, who arranged to have Nobuyuki marry Honda Tadakatsu's daughter, Komatsuhime. Realizing his war with the Hojo would probably not end as long as he held Numata, and realizing he needed a stronger protector than Kagekatsu, Masayuki approached Toyotomi Hideyoshi and pledged his allegiance to him. Unlike the conquest of Shikoku, which was a relative breeze for Hideyoshi's professional troops, Kyushu would be a tough nut to crack. At that time, the island was mostly under the control of the Shimazu clan, a family with long military traditions that had waged long wars in an effort to unite Kyushu under their rule. In 1586, they were engaged in a bloody conflict with the Otomo clan of Bungo province, their last obstacle. In May, fearing a defeat, the head of the clan, Otomo Sorin, sent an embassy to Osaka to ask the Toyotomi for assistance against the Shimazu threat. At that time, Hideyoshi was otherwise engaged in the pacification of Ki and preparing for the invasion of Shikoku, so he couldn't immediately intervene. Following his appointment as Kanpaku and taking advantage of his new authority, he issued an edict calling for the cessation of all hostilities in Kyushu, an order that Shimazu Yoshihisa promptly ignored. Thus, in October of that same year, the Toyotomi alliance made its first moves in Kyushu. Kobayakawa Takekage, who had proven his merit in Iyo, landed and acquired a foothold in Buzen. Meanwhile, the newest addition to the alliance, Chosokabe Motochika, led his samurai to Bungo with the assistance of Sengoku Hidehisa and Sogo Masayasu. From there, he joined forces with the Otomo and delayed the Shimazu advance. Despite the arrival of these reinforcements, the Shimazu still had the upper hand on the field and were besieging Suruga Castle when the Toyotomi forces camped behind them across the Hetsugi River. Ignoring Motochika's suggestion to await further reinforcements, Hidehisa ordered an attack, stating that the castle was their top priority. However, as the vanguard approached Suruga's walls, they were met with arquebus and arrow fire, for the Shimazu forces had already captured it. After a fierce fight, the Toyotomi forces were forced to withdraw, having paid a hefty price, as Sogo Masayasu and Chosokabe Nobuchika, Motochika's son and heir, perished. Having secured the freedom to move unobstructed, the Shimazu forces captured Funai Castle. Hidehisa, whom Hideyoshi regarded as personally responsible for this catastrophe, was stripped from all titles and lands and was sent into exile. Despite this blunder, Hidehisa and Motochika had served their purpose, in that they had bought enough time for the main body of the Toyotomi army to travel from Honshu to Kyushu. Raising troops from 77 daimyo, Hideyoshi amassed an enormous host of around 250,000 men, a force which grew even larger with the levies of the local Kyushu lords that opposed Shimazu rule. After crossing into the northernmost part of the island, which the Shimazu swiftly abandoned out of fear, Hideyoshi split his forces in two. Hidenaga would lead his regiment from the eastern road that passed through Bungo, while Hideyoshi would take the western approach. This road brought the Kanpaku first against the Akizuki clan in Chikuzen province, where he laid siege and captured Ganjaku Castle. Following the equally swift capture of the main seat of the Akizuki at Oguma, the clan joined Hideyoshi's side. Many other clans followed suit, as Hideyoshi moved his troops south towards Kagoshima, the seat of the Shimazu clan. On the other side of the island, Hidenaga had crossed from Bungo into Hyuga and laid siege to Takashiro Castle, where the Shimazu put up fierce resistance. Shimazu Ieyasu tried to relieve the siege at the head of around 20,000 men, and while he came close to dislodging the besiegers, he was ultimately forced to retreat, leaving the castle garrison to its fate. After securing Hyuga, Hidenaga moved to join forces with his brother in order to begin their final assault on Satsuma province. Determined not to go down without fighting, the Shimazu decided to engage Hideyoshi's approaching forces at Sendaigawa, a river that flowed just outside Kagoshima. Led by Niro Tadamoto, the 5,000 Shimazu warriors made an almost suicidal charge on the Toyotomi lines, but such was their force that they almost managed to break through and reach Hideyoshi's headquarters. The highlight of the battle was undoubtedly the duel between Kato Kiyomasa and Tadamoto, which ended with the former's victory, though Kiyomasa spared Tadamoto's life and retreated back to Kagoshima. Overcoming this final obstacle, Hideyoshi prepared to lay siege to Kagoshima. This battle, however, would never occur, for Shimazu Yoshihisa anticlimactically visited the Kanpaku's tent and surrendered the city without a fight. Just as he had done with Motochika, Hideyoshi allowed the Shimazu to retain control of their home province of Satsuma, as well as parts of Hyuga and Osumi, a gesture that the Shimazu wouldn't forget. All of the families that had supported Hideyoshi were allowed to keep their holdings, while Kobayakawa Takekage was promoted, since he exchanged the former fief of Iyo for new lands in Chikuzen, Chikugo, and Hizen. As we have already stated, even Narimasa was compensated with a small fief, but generally speaking, Hideyoshi did not disturb the status quo of Kyushu, and the clans continued to rule their ancestral lands, a move that earned him loyal vassals, if not friends, among the island's daimyo, and more importantly, troops to use in future campaigns. With Kyushu brought to heel, the western part of Japan now answered to Hideyoshi. But in the east, there were still powerful lords that defied his rule. During the course of 1586, Tokugawa Ieyasu had repaired his relations with Hideyoshi to some degree, but he also had ties to the Hojo of Kanto, who still hadn't submitted. Having brought the powerful Shimazu clan to heel, the Kanpaku now turned his gaze towards the other direction, the Kanto Plain and northeast Honshu. There, beyond Ieyasu's domain, lay the lands of the Hojo clan and the Date clan, the last powerful families whose allegiance was still on the fence. The Hojo, in particular, controlled the largest part of the fertile Kanto region, and ranked amongst the wealthiest families in Japan. If they wished, they could pose a significant threat to Toyotomi's regime. Their seat at Odawara Castle was a naturally fortified position, with the sea on one side and Mount Hakone and Lake Ashi on the other. The fortress was accessible only from two approaches, the coastal Tokaido Road and the mountainous Nakasendo, both of which were guarded by other Hojo castles. Naturally, the Hojo had reinforced Odawara's defenses with man-made fortifications. Moats, ditches, and strong walls complemented the banks and cliffs that surrounded the castle, making Odawara one of the strongest bastions in the land. Despite their own defensive strength, the Odawara Hojo had familial ties to the Tokugawa, as Ieyasu's daughter had married Hojo Ujinao, the son and heir of the clan head Hojo Ujimasa. Ieyasu on his own had provided a significant, if not insurmountable, challenge for Hideyoshi a few years before. If these two clans united against him this time, and perhaps attracted others like the Date, the Toyotomi could find themselves severely outnumbered and outgunned. At first, Hideyoshi tried to solve the Hojo issue through diplomacy. Twice, in 1588 and 1589, he sent envoys to Hojo Ujimasa, requesting the daimyo and his son to visit him in his villa in the capital and pay his respects, essentially submitting to Hideyoshi's hegemony. Ujimasa refused to do so, lulled into a false sense of security by his strong defenses and his ties to Ieyasu, and citing his poor health as an excuse. Luckily for the Hojo, Tokugawa Ieyasu intervened. Ieyasu suggested that Ujimasa's brother Ujinori make the trip. He also made it very clear that in the case Hojo refused to play ball, he would terminate their marriage alliance. Ujinori did indeed travel to Kyoto and visited Hideyoshi in his residence, the Jurokudai, a move that for the time being normalized the relations between the two clans. In 1589, Ujimasa promised to visit Hideyoshi in December on the excuse of settling a territorial dispute of the Numata area in northern Kanto. Hideyoshi wasn't keen to go to war with the Hojo, so he appeased Ujimasa by awarding him 2/3 of Numata and the hononymous castle, the Numata-jo, which previously belonged to the Sanada clan. However, Ujimasa probably had no intention of ever visiting, as he retracted his promise, sending another letter to Hideyoshi asking to reschedule the visit for the spring or summer of the following year, a move that angered the Kanpaku. The last straw came during the last months of 1589, when Kuninori Inomata, who had been given the lordship of Numata-jo by the Hojo, attacked and seized Nagarumi-jo from the Sanada. Normally, the capture of a single castle would not have caused havoc, but Inomata's attack flew in the face of Hideyoshi's order that no lord go to war with another without the Kanpaku's explicit consent. Despite pledges from Ujinao that Inomata had acted on his own, and that the castle had been returned to the Sanada, Hideyoshi had made up his mind. He had grown tired of the defiant Hojo, and decided that strength of arms would settle this once and for all. Having mustered all of his forces and those of his subordinate daimyo, Hideyoshi made his move against the Hojo in the early months of 1590. Maeda Toshie and Uesugi Kagekatsu would link up with the Sanada forces and take the northern and mountainous Nakasendo Road. Meanwhile, Hideyoshi's main force moved along the coastal Tokaido Road, led by Tokugawa Ieyasu. Finally, Chosakabe Motochika sailed to the port of Shimizu at the head of a substantially large navy. Toshie and Kagekatsu, with their 35,000 troops, laid siege to Hachigata Castle and its 3,000-strong garrison. After almost a month, the lord of Hachigata, Hojo Ujikuni, surrendered after securing assurances that the lives of his men would be spared. The same fate fell upon Hojo Ujiteru's Hachioji Castle, which they took through a costly frontal assault, overwhelming the 1,300-men-strong garrison with their own 15,000 attackers. In Musashi, another of Odawara's outlying castles, Oshi, came under siege by Hideyoshi's trusted minister, Ishida Mitsunari. The swamps and marshes, which stretched out as long as the castle's fortifications, hindered any direct assaults upon the walls, so Mitsunari copied his master's favorite tactic by constructing ditches to flood the castle. However, the defenders did not give up, and the castle would only surrender after the commander received word of Odawara's fall. Elsewhere, the Hojo castles fell one after the other. Then, in late spring, it was Odawara's turn. It was here that one of the most unusual sieges in Japanese history took place. As we have already stated, Odawara was a castle among castles. Its strong walls and numerous towers, bridges and courtyards guaranteed that the Hojo fortress was impervious to any frontal assault. Seeing that any attempt to take the castle by force would result in a bloodbath, Hideyoshi settled for a prolonged blockade to starve the garrison out. Just as he had done in Kamaki, he created his own fortifications, a series of trenches and palisades, and set up his own headquarters at Ishigaki-yama. Originally, Ujimasa wanted to sally out and meet the Toyotomi forces on the field. However, he was convinced to remain within the castle walls by one of his retainers, Matsuda Norihide, who had been secretly bribed by Hideyoshi. Since Odawara had a large stockpile of provisions, Ujimasa was content to stay idle. His soldiers were also highly spirited, since they were well fed and entertained. However, their music performances and games were nothing compared to what was happening on the other side of the walls. There, Hideyoshi was throwing a literal party, having brought in the wives and concubines of his men, as well as prostitutes, musicians, and actors to alleviate the boredom of his troops and to demoralize his opponents. Of course, the Toyotomi forces were not just partying day and night. At one point, a group of siege engineers from Kai managed to tunnel under Odawara, forcing a part of the outer wall to collapse. Taking advantage of the breach, Inamasa attacked the castle, but a staunch defense put up by the Hojo soldiers forced him to retreat. One day, the defenders of Odawara awoke to see a massive stone castle at the top of Ishigaki-yama that had seemingly appeared overnight. It sort of had. Hideyoshi's men had been constructing the castle these past 80 days, using a heavily forested area as a screen to hide their labor. When they were done, they chopped down the trees, revealing the castle. Thus, Hideyoshi created the illusion that the castle materialized overnight. Whether they believed the trick or rationalized Ishigaki-yama Castle's existence, its construction was the final nail in the coffin of the Odawara defenders' morale. A few days later, the last hope the Hojo might have still died when Date Masamune arrived with his army and joined the Toyotomi cause, even apologizing to Hideyoshi for being late during their personal meeting. With all other castles except Oshi having been captured and their last ally throwing their lot in with the enemy, the Hojo realized they couldn't win and offered their surrender. Perhaps they believed they would be permitted to rule over their lands, as the Shimazu in Kyushu. They were wrong. Ujimasa and his brother Ujiteru were forced to commit seppuku. Ujimasa's son and heir, Ujinao, was spared this fate on account of being Ieyasu's son-in-law, but both he and his wife were exiled to Mount Koya, where he died of smallpox a year later. The Kanto region had been ruled for almost a century by the later Hojo, but no more. Hideyoshi stripped them of their lands, though in time, Ujinori would be given Sayama province due to his good relationship with Tokugawa Ieyasu, and his family would hold that land until the Meiji Restoration over 200 years later. Kanto, the most fertile plain in all of Japan, went to Tokugawa Ieyasu. In hindsight, it wasn't a good move on Hideyoshi's part, since he was awarding the wealthiest region of the land to his biggest rival, effectively sending him on the path to becoming shogun. In return, Ieyasu gave up his ancestral land in Mikawa and those provinces he had conquered throughout his lifetime, including Totomi, Suruga, Shinano, and Kai. Still, his income skyrocketed to roughly 2.5 million koku, making him wealthier than Hideyoshi himself. Of course, Hideyoshi knew the economic value of Kanto. Hence his decision to give it to Ieyasu was most likely done in order to move him further away from the political center of Kyoto and to establish a powerful and dependable ally in the east to prevent any uprisings while Hideyoshi was busy invading Korea. In addition, Ieyasu would no longer be able to rely on Mikawa's battle-hardened and loyal samurai. Instead, he would have to earn the allegiance of the samurai he had just beaten. Perhaps Hideyoshi was gambling on the Kanto Bushi not fully dedicating themselves to their new daimyo. If he did, he was wrong. Yet the former Hojo lands were not the only ones to change hands. Hideyoshi had issued orders to the daimyo from northeast Honshu, including Date Masamune. These lords either neglected their orders completely, or like Masamune, came to Toyotomi's assistance too late. Thus, the Kanpaku punished them accordingly by rearranging their land holdings. Setting up his new headquarters at Utsunomiya, he began accepting the daimyo who peacefully recognized his hegemony. At the same time, his army toured Oshu under Masamune's guidance, and pacified the stubborn warlords by the sword. Despite providing Hideyoshi with his assistance, the Date daimyo was not exempt from this punishment, with his 1.1 million koku domain shrinking down to around 700,000. As expected, the redistribution of land left many lords displeased. and as soon as Hideyoshi's forces moved out of Tohoku, rebellions began sprouting. Former retainers of the Kasai and Asaki clans in central Mutsu rose up in Isawa County, demanding the rule of the land be returned to the Date. They were joined by thousands of peasants who were disappointed by the treatment of their new liege lord, Kimura Yoshikiyo, and the heavy taxation he imposed. At the same time, Waga Yoshitada and Hieinuki Hirutada revolted in Waga and Hieinuki counties respectively. The rebels, some suspected to be supported by Masamune himself, enjoyed some initial success in capturing Futago Castle in October, the seat of the Wafa clan. Later in the winter, they followed up their success by capturing Toriyagaseki Castle because of Nanbu Nobunao's inability to relieve the siege due to the snowy weather. This was only the start of Nobunao's problems. The new year brought a new insurrection in March. Konohei Masazane, who disputed Nobunao's succession to the head of the Nanbu clan, rose against him with around 5,000 experienced warriors at his back. He then began attacking Sanahei's surrounding castles. It wasn't long before news of the insurrections reached Hideyoshi's ears. While the same harsh winter conditions that hindered Nobunao's actions would also prevent him from intervening, the situation would change in spring. Determined to bring peace across the land, Hideyoshi sent 30,000 men, led by Toyotomi Hideyoshi and Tokugawa Ieyasu, to re-punish Oshu for its insubordination. This would be the Kanpaku's final war fought on Japanese soil. They were joined by other great names of their time: Uesugi Kageketsu, Otani Yoshitsugu, Maeda Toshie, Ishida Mitsunari, and Date Masamune, who helped to put down the very rebels who wanted him as their ruler in an effort to clear the suspicion around his name. At the same time, another 60,000-man strong division that local troops had reinforced was pressing hard to suppress Masazane's revolt. On the 2nd of September, they laid siege to Konohei Castle after capturing the outlying forts. The fortress was protected by rivers on 3 sides and a cliff on the other, making it a natural stronghold. Despite enjoying this strong position, Masazane realized he was vastly outnumbered and sued for peace on the condition that the lives of those inside be spared. The castle was formally surrendered 2 days later, but the attackers went back on their promise, killing everyone inside, while Masazane and other leaders of the rebellion were transferred to Misako and executed. The end of the Konohei Rebellion also brought the end of Hideyoshi's war in Japan. After almost a decade, he had finally pacified and united the land, fulfilling his predecessor's ambition. However, while victorious in the field, Hideyoshi would experience tragedy at home. The summer of 1591 was a black month for the Kanpaku, as his 3-year-old son, Tsurumatsu, died. His brother Hidenaga soon followed. Fearing a possible succession crisis that could plunge the Toyotomi clan into jeopardy, Hideyoshi adopted his nephew Hidetsugu and proclaimed him as his heir in the first month of the following year. Hideyoshi also appointed him as Kanpaku, while he himself retired with the title of Taiko, or retired regent. As Taiko, he could escape from the everyday duties he had to face while holding the office of the imperial regent, while still wielding significant power and remaining the military authority of the land. He also served as Hidetsugu's shield, preventing any thoughts of rebellion against the young Kanpaku. That same year, Hideyoshi would embark on his first overseas adventure, launching the first invasion of Korea and starting the Imjin War, which we have already covered and you can watch in great detail in our past videos. However, the appointment of Hidetsugu as Kanpaku did not really provide the smooth transition and stabilization Hideyoshi had hoped for. Instead, it created a power dipole, with the two factions clashing frequently. In 1593, Hideyoshi's second wife, Yododono, provided him with another natural son, Hideyori. Hideyori's birth created even more tensions within the Toyotomi camp, as Hideyoshi now had a natural son to promote as heir. History may not repeat, but it does rhyme, and the Toyotomi succession issue began to look very much like the crisis that sparked the Onin War, which led to the downfall of the Ashikaga. 2 years later, Hideyoshi was becoming increasingly more paranoid regarding his power, which led him to strip Hidetsugu of his titles, exile him to Mount Koya, and order him to commit seppuku. Hidetsugu complied with the Taiko's request. It was another grave mistake on Hideyoshi's part. 3 years later, and while his Korean campaign had taken a turn towards the horrible, Hideyoshi's health began deteriorating rapidly. Sensing his end was fast approaching, and his 5-year-old son would have no male relative to protect him and handle power until Hideyori came of age, Hideyoshi formed the Gotairo. The Council of the Five Elders was made up of 5 of the most powerful daimyo in the land, designed to prevent one rising above the others. These were Tokugawa Ieyasu, Maeda Toshie, Ukita Hideiie, Uesugi Kegeketsu, and Mori Terremoto. They swore to handle political affairs, to protect and guide Hideyori, and ensure his succession. On the 18th of September 1598, at Fushimi Castle, the Taiko drew his last breath. He had risen from humble peasant origins to become the most powerful man in Japan. With his death, he would claim an even greater honor and become a god, leaving behind an everlasting legacy as the second unifier of Japan. But for now, the way was open for Ieyasu to pursue his own ambitions and become shogun. By 1598, the war in Korea had taken a turn for the worse for the Japanese, and Hideyoshi's health had begun rapidly deteriorating. The entire clan of the Toyotomi was in great jeopardy, for Hideyoshi's son Hideyori was only a 5-year-old child. As the Taiko could sense his end coming, and wanted to secure a smooth transition of power to his son, he created a council of 5 powerful daimyo to rule the land in his stead and guide young Hideyori until he came of age. The chosen 5 were all of relatively equivalent military strength, thereby preventing any one of them from concentrating enough power to overthrow the Toyotomi hegemony. These 5 elders consisted of Maeda Toshie, Ukita Hidei, Uesugi Kageketsu, Mori Terremoto, and Tokugawa Ieyasu, who was by far the strongest and richest of them. In addition to the Council of the 5 Elders, Hideyoshi facilitated the transition of power by creating a set of laws designed to maintain the balance of power. Toyotomi Hideyoshi died in September of 1598, thus ending the life of the peasant who had become a dictator and unified Japan. Not long after his death, Ieyasu began making his moves, creating a web of alliances through marriage in order to consolidate power. This was an open defiance of Hideyoshi's laws forbidding this practice for that exact reason. The most prominent of these marriages was that of Ieyasu's 6th son, Teruteru, to the daughter of Dete Masamune. Naturally, the rest of the Council of 5 objected to this. Still, Ieyasu's military might prevented them from escalating into open conflict with him, and the matter was eventually smoothed over. The only man who dared to oppose Ieyasu was Ishida Mitsunari, who held significant power within the Toyotomi government. Lacking the political and military power to confront the Tokugawa daimyo by himself, Mitsunari approached Nobunaga's old general, the elderly Maeda Toshie, and attempted to pit him against Ieyasu. However, this conflict between the 2 most powerful men of the realm was prevented by Hosokawa Tadaoki, a friend to both Ieyasu and Toshie. Tadaoki convinced Toshie's son that it was in his family's best interests to keep Ieyasu around as a counterweight to Mitsunari. After his plan to turn the Maeda against the Tokugawa failed, Mitsunari attempted to have Ieyasu assassinated, with the latter narrowly escaping the attempt on his life. Not long after, it was Mitsunari's turn to face mortal peril. Toshie had thus far shielded Mitsunari from the military faction of the Toyotomi government, but that shield evaporated after Toshie passed away. In the early spring of 1599, a group of Toyotomi generals attempted to arrest and execute Mitsunari while he was leaving Toshie's residence at Osaka. These men harbored deep hatred for Mitsunari since the days of the Korean War, accusing Mitsunari of underreporting their achievements and sabotaging the campaign. However, Mitsunari was informed of their attempt and was able to escape secretly, allegedly inside a woman's palanquin. After getting out of Dodge, he made his way to Fushimi, seeking the protection of none other than Tokugawa Ieyasu. Ieyasu, who must have known of Mitsunari's machinations, sheltered him from the generals and escorted Mitsunari to the safety of a Shida domain. The death of the elderly Maeda Toshie had presented Ieyasu with a golden opportunity, as now there was virtually nobody left in the capital with enough political influence to oppose him. Consequently, Ieyasu stepped in as the prepubescent Toyotomi Hideyori's sole guardian and moved into Osaka Castle, the young heir's residence. It was during this time that another plot to assassinate Ieyasu was discovered. With his grip on Osaka secured, Ieyasu began planting his own men in key positions and winning over those who opposed him by granting them fiefs. While these moves angered the elders who opposed Ieyasu, they were not exactly in a position to oppose him with force, being either busy facing rebellions within their own lands or beholden to Ieyasu for military or political aid. However, there was one elder with the military strength to rise up against Ieyasu. From his home at Sawayama, Mitsunari had been exchanging correspondence with Uesugi Kagekatsu, enticing him to strike the Tokugawa. However, word of Kagekatsu's war preparations, mainly the construction of a new castle at Sekigahara, soon reached Ieyasu's ears. In early spring of the following year, Ieyasu summoned Kagekatsu to come to the capital and explain his actions. He received the pithy reply that the construction was nothing more than the yearly maintenance that was normally required. In May 1600, Ieyasu sent Fujita Nobuyoshi to Echigo to act as his envoy and convince Kagekatsu to travel to the capital. However, as soon as the man had set foot on Uesugi's domain, Kenetsugu accused him of being a spy and tried to have him arrested and executed. Nobuyoshi was able to escape by the skin of his teeth and reported on Kagekatsu's hostility. In late July, Ieyasu left Osaka and moved to Edo, where he gathered his forces before leading his army to Aizu to confront the Uesugi threat. Before leaving for Edo, Ieyasu convinced his longtime and trusted friend Tori Mototada to stay and guard Fushimi against any potential move from Mitsunari and his allies. This turned out to be the right move, because as soon as he departed, Mitsunari began assembling an anti-Tokugawa coalition. The Council of Five member Mori Teramoto was easily persuaded to join the pro-Toyotomi Western Army as its nominal commander. At the same time, 3 of the elders signed a letter of impeachment, which detailed 13 of Ieyasu's crimes and violations of the late Taiko's laws. Wasting little time, Ishida took over Osaka Castle, with the intent of taking the family members of various rival generals who lived there as hostages, forcing them to either ally with him or at the very least not oppose him. However, this plan backfired when Mitsunari's men tried to capture Hosokawa Tadaoki's wife, Hosokawa Gracia, resulting in her suicide at the hands of one of her servants. Gracia's death naturally solidified the Hosokawa family's position at the side of the Tokugawa faction, despite Mitsunari's wish to sway them to his. Gracia's sacrifice also caused a general uproar among the clans against Mitsunari's behavior, forcing him to abandon his plan. 2 days later, a part of the Western Army, led by Kobayakawa Hideaki, Shimazu Yoshihiro, Okita Hidei, and Nabeshima Katsushige, marched to Fushimi Castle with 40,000 men and laid siege to it on August 27th. However, the 2,000-strong garrison that was led by Mototada and Matsudaira Ieyatada was determined to fight to the death and buy as much time as possible for Ieyasu to wrap up his campaign against the Uesugi and turn to face the Western Army. Over 10 days, the besiegers made little progress, for not even their burning towers were able to dissuade the defenders. Yet they were soon betrayed by a turncoat from within, who opened the gates for the attackers. Even as hundreds of enemy troops swarmed the castle's defenses, Mototada refused to surrender, fighting with 200 remaining loyal men until each one had been cut down by the enemy or committed seppuku. The following day, the pro-Tokugawa Maeda Toshinaga successfully attacked his own brother at Daishoji Castle, forcing the commanding general Yamaguchi Nunenaga to commit seppuku. 9 days later, Ishida's forces had reached Ogaki Castle in Mino Province, but the damage had already been done. When word that Mitsunari had raised an army reached Ieyasu, he immediately halted his campaign against Kagekatsu and marched towards Owari with the majority of his troops. At the same time, a smaller division under his son Hideyasu remained in Aizu to keep the Uesugi army in check. Ieyasu then dispatched 16,000 men under Fukushima Masanori ahead of him along the Tokaido Road. He also appointed his generals Koroda Nagamasa, Honda Tadakatsu, Ii Naomasa, and Hosokawa Tadaoki to reinforce the defenders of Kyosu Castle, which was held by the pro-Tokugawa Osaki Genba, and to wrestle control of Gifu Castle from Oda Hidenobu, who had weirdly thrown in his lot with the Toyotomi faction. Oda Hidenobu was none other than Nobunaga's grandson, whom Hideyoshi had used during the Kyosu Conference to supplant Oda authority. He had been an infant back then, and in adulthood would bizarrely side with the clan of the man who had usurped what was rightfully his. On the 28th of the same month, Gifu came under attack from the forces of the Eastern Army, who captured the castle with ease. Thereafter, Hidenobu was placed under arrest in one of the nearby mountain monasteries to await his fate. The next day, the Tokugawa forces occupied the Akasaka Heights in order to put pressure on Ogaki Castle. While the Eastern Army moved with astonishing speed, the Western Army was disjointed, as Mitsunari's allies dragged their feet to Ogaki, or remained entrenched within Osaka. This dithering gave Tokugawa's forces the necessary time to protect Kyosu and capture Gifu. Ieyasu arrived at Akasaka on November 20th, where he set up camp on a small hill called Okayama. Ieyasu's arrival caused a commotion among the Western Army's generals, who nonetheless decided to test the waters and conduct a small raid on the eastern camp, led by the legendary samurai Shima Sakon. Sakon left half of his 500-man force in an ambush position as the rest of the group crossed the Kuisagara River at the bridge and attacked the eastern camp, where the Tokugawa general Nakamura Kazuuji was positioned. Nakamura counterattacked, pursuing the western forces across the bridge, whereupon he fell right into Sakon's ambush. However, Nakamura's men were reinforced by those of another commander, Arima Toyouji, preventing Sakon from pushing onto the other side of the river. The setting sun forced the two sides to retreat back to their camps. While the skirmish hadn't achieved much other than destroying the bridge, it made evident to Mitsunari and the rest of the western generals that their position was not ideal. Ieyasu could easily bypass Ogeki and march directly to Sawayama and Osaka. During their night conference, Shimazu Yoshihiro suggested a night attack, noting that Tokugawa's men were likely exhausted from their long and speedy journey. Ukita Hidei supported this idea, but Sakon disagreed and insulted Yoshihiro by saying that only cowards and weaklings would use such tactics. Since the numbers clearly favored them, Sakon added, they would surely emerge victorious from a pitched battle. In the end, Mitsunari concluded that the best course of action was to retreat a few miles to the southwest of Ogeki, where the roads converged, and they could intercept Ieyasu's forces no matter what. After leaving behind 7,000 to 8,000 men to defend Ogeki, the rest of the Western Army moved and took positions at these crossroads, a place called Sekigahara. Already at Sekigahara was Kobayakawa Hideaki, who had perched himself atop the nearby high ground of Mount Matsuo, with 20,000 men. Ishida would place his own headquarters and 6,000 men opposite Hideaki near Mount Sasao, where the levies of Shima Sakon, Gamo Bitchu, Shimazu Toyohisa, and Shimazu Yoshihiro joined him. In addition, 2,000 Toyotomi soldiers under Oda Nobunaga, Kishida Tadauji, and Ito Norimasa took up positions there. Towards the center, and in front of Lake Ikedera, Kanishi Yukinaga positioned his own 4,000 troops. At the foot of Mount Tengu, Ukita Hidei took up the center of the Western Army's lineup with his 17,000 soldiers, and just to the left of Hideaki's camp were Otani Yoshitsugu, Todo Shigemasa, and Otani Yoshikatsu, leading no more than 6,000 men total. Their deployment meant that Ieyasu's force would be drawn into a position where Hideaki's troops could easily come down the mountain and attack the exposed flank, securing their victory. Moreover, Mitsunari could always count on the forces of Mori Hidimoto, Kikawa Hiroie, and Chosokabe Morichika, who were just around Mount Nengu and could attack Ieyasu's army at its soft underbelly. As Ieyasu became aware of Mitsunari's movements, he ordered the Eastern Army to move towards Sekigahara. As the Eastern Army poured into the valley, Kuroda Nagamasa, Hosokawa Tadaoki, and an assembly of other Tokugawa generals took up positions opposite Mitsunari's army with a total of 20,000 men. Behind them was another reserve force of around 11,000 men. At the center of Ieyasu's formation, and just opposite Ukita Hidei, was Fukushima Masanori with 6,000 men. The Tokugawa generals Toru Takatora and Kyogoku Takatomo covered the left flank, with 2,500 and 3,000 men respectively. Further behind were the Tokugawa generals of Terazawa Hirotaka, Hondo Tadakatsu, and Togawa Michiyasu, with no more than 3,500 men. Ieyasu's own contingent of 30,000 deployed in the rear, at the foot of Mount Momokubari, while regiments belonging to Arima Toyouji had deployed along the Nakasendo Road. As the fog that had masked their movements disappeared, Inaomasa charged towards Ukita Hidei's lines. His attack entrained into Fukushima Masanori, who too wanted the honor of being the first to clash with the enemy. Before long, the rest of the Eastern Army followed suit. Tadaoki and his adjacent Tokugawa generals launched a coordinated assault towards Mitsunari's position, smashing into the defensive lines of Shima Sakon and Gamobichu's position. To support this attack, Togawa Michiyasu and Ukoma Kazumasa moved their arquebusiers forward and fired on Mitsunari's men. On almost the other end of the battlefield, Tokugawa forces, under the command of Kyogoku Takatomo, Todo Takatora, and Terazawa Hirotaka, fell on Otani Yoshitsugu's position. The battle was the fiercest on Kuroda Nagamasa's flank, for he harbored personal hatred towards Mitsunari ever since the end of the Korean War. It was there, in the heat of the battle, that a bullet hit Shima Sakon. While the legendary samurai was safely transferred to the rear, he later succumbed to his wound. Thus, Mitsunari was deprived of one of his most loyal and brilliant generals. With the help of cannon fire, Mitsunari was able to push the Tokugawa forces back. In response, Kato Yoshiaki and Hosokawa Tadaoki redoubled their efforts. The fight progressed in this manner almost across the entire battle line. One side would push the other, then it would get pushed back. Yet cracks were already starting to appear in the Western Army. Kobayakawa Hideyaki's men remained perched on Mount Matsuo, having wasted the opportunity to attack the flank of the Tokugawa forces. The Shimazu too had yet to commit to the fight, and remained on the small hill they occupied. Mitsunari rode personally to Lord Yoshihiro to ask him to engage with the enemy, as the proud Shimazu daimyo had previously rejected the order that was delivered by a messenger. Ishida had little luck, as Yoshihiro more or less replied that each clan should prioritize saving its own skin. Mitsunari returned to his camp, hoping that Yoshihiro would join the fight when he found the opportunity he wanted. For now, he could only rely on the yet uncommitted forces of Hideaki and the Mori troops beyond Mount Nangu. Around 11 AM, Mitsunari was feeling confident that the time for the pincer move had come, and signaled for the Mori and the Kobayakawa forces to attack. Hideaki made no move even when Mitsunari repeated the signal. Similarly, Mori Hidemoto remained in position on the other side of Mount Nangu alongside Lord Hiroie of the Kakawa clan. Unbeknownst to Mitsunari, both Hiroie and Hideaki had contacted Ieyasu weeks before the battle, offering to turn to his side. Hiroie was acting on the orders of Lord Mori Teramoto, who was anxious about losing his territory and wanted to keep out of the conflict as much as possible. Hiroie acted on his Lord Teramoto's wish by blocking Hidemoto, who genuinely wanted to support the Toyotomi cause, as well as obstructing the Chosokabe force. The story was a bit different for the 19-year-old Hideaki, who was truly conflicted as to which side to support. Still, it seems that his eventual betrayal expressed the collective desire of the Kobayakawa clan and his retainers. Around noon, Hideaki's men finally descended from the mountain. However, their target was Otani Yoshitsugu's group, and not Fukushima Morimasa's flank. Yoshitsugu's men were already engaging the Tokugawa forces on their front, and stood no chance as the Kobayakawa forces cut through them like a hot knife through butter. Realizing the battle was lost and escape impossible, Yoshitsugu asks one of his retainers to kill him. Hideaki's men continued to push, reaching Hideie and Yukinaga's lines, while Ina Masa engaged the Shimazu. With the Western Army collapsing, Hideie and Yukinaga fled to the safety of the mountains. Yoshihiro too was able to escape after his nephew Toyohisa put up a fierce defense to stop Naomasa's cavalry, dying in the process. While pursuing the fleeing Yoshihiro, Naomasa was struck by arquebus fire. His men broke off the pursuit and carried their wounded lord to the camp. While Naomasa would survive the battle, he would eventually succumb to his wounds 18 months later. So it was that Yoshihiro and the rest of the Shimazu were free to flee towards the south to Mount Nangu. There they were seen by the still stationary Mori and Chosokabe troops, who realized the battle was lost. Finally, Mitsunari escaped to the mountains with a few of his close retainers. The battle was over, and Ieyasu was now free to move to the capital and tie up any loose ends. You may have wondered where Ieyasu's son Hidetada and his 36,000 men had been during the battle. After all, the original plan was for him to follow the Nakasendo road and link up with the main force in Mino. However, Hidetada chose to instead stop and lay siege to Ueda Castle. Ueda's lord, Sanada Masayuki, had joined the Toyotomi faction alongside his youngest son, even as his eldest son, Nobuyuki, was fighting for the Tokugawa. This wasn't a family split over politics, but rather the circumstances of how Masayuki had married his sons. Yukimura had married the daughter of Otani Yoshitsugu, while Nobuyuki married the daughter of Honda Tadaketsu. Thus, each Sanada brother joined the side of their father-in-law. It was both an unfortunate and convenient position for Masayuki. For whatever the outcome of the battle, the Sanada clan could profit. For the time being, he had to face Hidetada's massive army outside his walls, with no more than 2,000 of his own men. Still, Ueda's defenses proved impregnable, and the few skirmishes around the castle had no major outcome. Having wasted enough time, Hidetada finally broke the siege at his father's orders, and hastened to join the main body, but by the time he arrived it was already all over. Similarly late for the main battle were 15,000 men of the Western Army, led by Mori Motoyasu, Tachibana Muneshige, and Sakushi Hirokado, who laid siege at the castle of Otsu near Lake Biwa. The victory at Sekigahara was the most crucial point of the war, but not exactly the end. Losing no time, Ieyasu marched to Sawayama, where, after a brief siege, Mitsunari's father committed seppuku, and the castle fell. Not long after, Mitsunari himself was captured. He was executed in Kyoto, in a public showcase of who was the master of Japan now. As for Ukita Hideiie, he initially went into hiding in Satsuma, but was discovered in 1603 and subsequently sent into exile to Hachijojima, where he lived until his death in 1655. Ieyasu was more lenient towards Mori Teramoto, who, after all, hadn't actually fought against him. Still, he hadn't remained neutral either, and so Ieyasu reduced his territory to 1/4 of his possessions, awarding the rest to Kikawa Hiroie. At that time, Ieyasu made no move against Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who was still a child. His war had been with Mitsunari, and perhaps he felt no need to stir more controversy by attacking the defenseless boy. Or maybe he thought that the Toyotomi clan would no longer cause any trouble. Following the decisive victory at Sekigahara and the mop-up of any minor resistance elsewhere in Japan, Ieyasu emerged as the undisputed ruler of the island nation. In 1603, he formally received the title of shogun, a position he would retain for only 2 years, as in 1605 he abdicated in favor of his son Hidetada and assumed the title of Ogosho, the retired shogun. Ieyasu lost no time solidifying his rule, and immediately began to work to turn Edo into the seat of the new Tokugawa administration. The various daimyo of the land were moved around the provinces of Japan like pawns to suit Ieyasu's policy. It mattered little whether a daimyo had sided with Ieyasu or had opposed him. In fact, some of his most trusted generals found themselves far away, occupying key castles across the land that controlled vital roads, thus preventing any coalitions from forming against the shogunate. Of course, their loyalty and ties to the Tokugawa family did matter when it came to ranks within the Bakufu's administration, with Fudai daimyo occupying the higher ranks. While Edo was his seat of power, Ieyasu hadn't forgotten about Kyoto and made sure to firmly establish his control of the imperial city by refurbishing Fushimi Castle and constructing Nijo Castle, which would also serve as his residence there. These castles were also vital in keeping what remained of the Toyotomi clan in check. Ieyasu had defeated the Western coalition at Sekigahara and reduced Hideyori's income to slightly below 700,000 koku annually, but the Toyotomi had amassed great wealth since the days of Hideyoshi. In addition, owing to Hideyoshi's diplomatic skills, many of the defeated daimyo still maintained friendly relations with the Toyotomi and could perhaps rally behind Hideyori to overthrow the Tokugawa government. During the first years of his rule, Ieyasu tried a more diplomatic approach. Hideyori himself was too young to lead a military campaign, while there were also rumors of him being effeminate. So Ieyasu attempted to bridge the gap between the two families by marrying the eldest daughter of Hidetata, Senhime, to Hideyori in 1603. However, everything changed in 1611, when Yodo Dono, Hideyori's overprotective mother, allowed him out of the safety of the formidable Osaka castle, and the two men met and talked face-to-face for the first and last time. Instead of meeting with the weakling the rumors suggested Hideyori was, Ieyasu found himself opposite a brilliant young man, a worthy successor to Hideyoshi, which caused him great alarm. Sure, Hideyori wasn't as competent as Hideyoshi, but neither was Hidetata the equal of Ieyasu. The Ogosho, who was drawing ever closer to the end of his life, could simply not take any chances to let his life's work be undone. The Toyotomi had to be eradicated, and from then on, the search began for a pretext to ignite the hostilities. That came in 1614, in the form of a temple bell. That bell was part of Hideyori's project to restore a Buddhist temple, and the Toyotomi made the unfortunate mistake of writing 2 inscriptions on the bell. It was a stretch, but the Tokugawa managed to find them offensive, even their wishing for the well-being of the state, claiming the characters were written in such a way that mocked Ieyasu. An attempt was made to solve the crisis diplomatically, but the situation only worsened. Sensing the upcoming war, Hideyori began expanding his castle's defenses and amassing a vast host of ronin in Osaka. These masterless samurai had come to his state thanks to Ieyasu, who had defeated their previous lords, and were more than happy for a chance to get back at the retired shogun. Amongst these men was Sanada Yukimura, an accomplished and famed warrior who had fought for the Toyotomi in the past at Sekigahara. Together with Goto Moritsugu, they proposed to take the fight to Ieyasu and capture some key positions where the Nakasendo and Tokaido roads meet to prevent the Eastern Army from reaching Kyoto. It was roughly the same strategy Ishida Mitsunari had followed 14 years earlier. By blocking the road to Kyoto, they could then secure the city and use the emperor to declare Ieyasu an enemy of the throne, a move that could swing many daimyo and samurai to their side. Hideyori instead preferred to stay in Osaka and let Ieyasu come to him. It wasn't a choice born of cowardice. Osaka Castle, which had been built over the older Ishiyama Hongan-ji, was a formidable fortress. It had strong walls, deep and wide moats and canals, and natural defences in the form of rivers to the north. Only the southern side of the complex could realistically be chosen for an attack, and its defences were further reinforced by digging a moat and constructing a 2-story tall earthwork barbican behind it, called the Sanada Maru, after Yukimura. In mid-November, the shogunate's forces began their offensive on the outskirts and the outlying forts that surrounded Osaka, with the first action taking place at the port city of Sakai. Within a month, the bulk of the Eastern Army, including Ieyasu's and Hidetada's own regiments, had surrounded the main complex, with Ieyasu's allies moving to secure the riverside forts, firstly capturing Kizigawa-guchi on the 19th of December. On the 26th, Shigeno fell to the forces of Uesugi Kagekatsu, and on the same day, just across the river to the north, Satake Yoshinobu was able to capture the 3 forts at Iwafuku. Despite launching a counterattack led by Kimura Shigenari and Goto Moritsugu, the Toyotomi forces were unable to reclaim control of the forts. 3 days later, the shogunate's forces, under the command of Ishikawa Tadafusa and Hachisuka Yoshishige, captured Bakuruguchi, while Kuki Moritaka and Ikeda Tadetsugu captured the forts of Noda and Fukushima respectively. With all of Osaka's outlying forts having been brought under the Eastern Army's control, Ieyasu prepared to assault the main castle at its weakest point, the Sanada Maru. On the 3rd of January of the new year, the shogunate's forces began their attack on the sector that was defended by Sanada Yukimura and his troop, with Maeda Toshitsune's forces capturing the hill of Sasayama, where Yukimura had originally placed his forward headquarters. With that done, and joined by the troops of Matsudaira Tadanao and Ii Naotaka, he proceeded to cross the dry moat and attack Sanada Maru's walls directly. However, the attack soon turned into a real bloodbath, as the accurate arquebus fire of the defenders cut down many of the attackers. With casualties mounting, Tadanao and Naotaka pivoted their assault and headed towards the gate of Hachome-guchi. Their men managed to climb the ramparts and temporarily breached Osaka's defences, before Kimura Shigenari and his troops drove them off. The following day, the Tokugawa forces, under Todo Takarora, tried their luck on the westernmost gate of Osaka's south side, the Tanamachi-guchi. Still, once again, they were unable to dislodge the staunch defenders. With the assaults on Sanada Maru and the castle's gates yielding poor results, Ieyasu changed his strategy and decided to hammer Osaka's garrison with his artillery. Amongst the 300 pieces he had positioned around the fortress was his hidden ace up his sleeve, 10 European-bought heavy cannons. Starting on the 8th and for 3 consecutive days, the Tokugawa artillery fired salvos at 10 o'clock at night and dawn's first light, while miners dug under Osaka's walls. Yet even that approach proved to be of little effectiveness, as the castle's walls were thick and the damage sustained was minimal. To add salt to the wound, the defenders sallied out one night and attacked Hachisuka Yoshishige's camp. With even the European guns being no match for the castle's defences, Ieyasu rethought his approach, and, taking advantage of their superior range, he began shelling the buildings in the innermost courtyards, betting on the psychological effect of the bombardment. On the 15th, he deliberately targeted Yodo Dono's private apartments, knowing that she was very influential amongst the Toyotomi faction, and her demoralization could bring an end to the campaign. 2 days later, on the anniversary of Hideyoshi's death, Ieyasu's artillery fired a shot at the temple, surmising that Hideyori would visit the place to pay respects to his late father. The shot missed, and instead landed once again at Yodo Dono's apartments, killing 2 of her maids. Following that, and as Ieyasu had correctly assumed, the panicked woman brought the Toyotomi side to the negotiations table. The peace negotiations didn't last long. Already by the 21st, a deal had been reached, with Ieyasu promising to respect the lives of the Ronin that had joined the Toyotomi cause, and to allow Hideyori and his mother to reside wherever they wished without reducing their income. On their part, Hideyori and Yododono promised never to rebel against the shogunate again. It was a deal that was just too good to be true, and it wasn't long before Ieyasu showed his true intentions, for as he took the road back to Kyoto, his soldiers dropped their weapons and, now armed with pickaxes and shovels, began demolishing Osaka's outer defenses and filling in the moats. Alarmed by the destruction of their walls, the Toyotomi complained that this was not part of the peace deal. But when word reached Ieyasu, he dismissed them, saying that since peace prevailed, they no longer had any need for walls. It was now obvious the peace agreement was a trap, and the Toyotomi had fallen right in. Without a single shot fired, Ieyasu had neutralized much of Osaka's defenses before his soldiers were forced to stop. Realizing there could be no compromise with the Tokugawa, Hideyori regathered his forces and both sides prepared for the second round. Seeing how his static defense strategy had produced poor results during the winter campaign, and with Osaka's fortifications significantly weakened, this time Hideyori agreed to take on the offensive. On the 23rd of May, Ono Harufusa and Goto Motetsugu crossed the Kurogari Pass at the Ikoma Mountains and attacked Koriyama Castle, but were unable to capture it. The next day, Harufusa marched out of Osaka, this time heading south to Sakai, before proceeding towards Kishiwada Castle. On the way, he was intercepted by Asano Nagaakira, who had set out from Wakayama at the head of a 5,000-strong regiment. The two armies clashed at Kashi on the 26th, with Nagaakira's soldiers emerging victorious, forcing Harufusa to return to Osaka. A few days later, on the 2nd of June, Ieyasu and Hidetada left Kyoto with 120,000 men, this time taking a more direct route towards Osaka, while another regiment, roughly 40,000 strong, under Date Masamune, took the long route over the road that led to Nara. On the following day, Masamune's group would clash with Goto Motetsugu's 2,800-strong vanguard near Daimyo-ji. Motetsugu was moving his forces to the hill of Kometsuyama, hoping to capture it before the shogunate's forces could pass. At dawn, the two sides clashed at the top of the hill, with Motetsugu's forces initially pushing back the soldiers of Hondo Tadamasa and Matsudaira Tadaaki. However, the main body of the Osaka army, led by Sanada Yukimura, lagged behind the Ishikawa River. At the same time, Masamune's own men were able to join the fray, and their numerical advantage soon turned the tide. The Tokugawa forces pushed the vanguard back, and then crossed the river, where they engaged Yukimura's army at Daimyo-ji. Following a fierce fight, Yukimura ordered a retreat, leaving behind many dead, amongst them Motetsugu and Susukida Kanesuke. At the same time, and a few miles to the north, the Osaka forces also engaged the shogunate's forces at 2 points near the villages of Yao and Wakae. At Yao, Chosokabe Morichika, with his 5,300-strong corps, faced off against Todo Takarora's similarly sized force, while in Wakae, Kimura Shigenari engaged the Red Devils of Inautaka. Both battles resulted in defeat for the Osaka forces, and Ieyasu continued his advance towards Osaka, where the climactic battle between the two sides would take place. Ieyasu's plan was the same as the last time. He wanted to take up positions at the hills of Cha-Usuyama and Okayama, but as he approached Osaka, he saw that Cha-Usuyama had already been occupied by Yukimura, who had set up his headquarters there. At Yukimura's left stood Mori Katsunaga, commanding a large group of Ronin. The center of Ieyasu's army was made up of forces belonging to Sanada Nobuyuki, who was Yukimura's older brother, Honda Tadatomo, Asano Nagashige, and Akita Sanesue. Behind them followed Ogasawara Hidemasa, Hoshina Masamitsu, Sakakibara Yasukatsu, Suwa Tadazumi, and Matsudaira Tadanao. To their left, holding the road, were the forces of Date Masamune and Asano Nagaakira. On the right came the forces belonging to Maeda Toshitsune, Katagiri Katsumoto, Tokugawa Hidetata, Todo Takarora, Hosokawa Tadaoki, and Inautaka. Not all of the large Tokugawa army had managed to take up their respective positions when Mori Katsunaga, unable to control his men, many of whom were rowdy Ronin, gave in to their demands and ordered an attack. Their fierce assault took the Tokugawa soldiers by surprise, and they managed to overwhelm the first lines. The attack went contrary to Yukimura's plan, who wanted to draw Ieyasu's men to his position. Still, seeing the success and not wanting to miss the opportunity, he too attacked, while at the same time sending a messenger to Hideyori, urging him to sally out of the castle with his own troops. The combined attack put the shogunate's troops in a tough position, and to make matters worse, an extreme flanking maneuver attempted by Naga Akira was mistaken as a betrayal, causing further chaos. So dire was the situation that Ieyasu himself rode there to inspire his troops and turn the situation around. There, the legend says that Yukimura spotted him and managed to wound him, while another version claims that he was able to kill the Agosho, and a body double took his place. In reality, however, it was Yukimura who would perish in the heat of the battle. Exhausted from the fierce fight, he sat on a stool to rest, but was spotted by a samurai named Nishio Munetsugu, who beheaded him. Deprived of their leader and facing pincer attacks from Inoutaka and Todo Takatora on their left and Dete Masamune on their right, Yukimura's men began retreating towards the castle. On the other side, at Okayama, Maeda Toshitsune's forces were still fighting against those of Ono Harunaga. The fight was not going well for the Tokugawa until Naotaka and Takatora, having successfully pushed back Yukimura's men, turned back and assisted their comrades there, pursuing Harunaga's men to the castle. At roughly the same time, Ikeda Tadetsugu sailed up the Tenma River and attacked Osaka from that side, while Ishikawa Tadefusa, Kyogoku Tadetaka, and Kyogoku Takatono assaulted the castle from the Shigeno area in the northeast. Hideyori finally made his appearance, but it was already too late. His men needed him to inspire them hours ago. Now it was 4 in the afternoon. Many of his best generals had died, and Ieyasu's men had reached the Sakura Gate. Osaka was engulfed in chaos as melee fights broke out in the streets, buildings were set on fire, and Ieyasu's artillery pounded the castle from afar. Many fled, while others took their own lives. Only a few stayed to protect Hideyori and Yododono, who sought refuge in a fireproof storage. They spent the night there, but by the morning, having realized Ieyasu would not parley this time, both mother and son took their own lives. Thus, the Toyotomi line was extinguished, and Ieyasu could rest, knowing that no other clan could challenge the Tokugawa's authority. A year later, on the 1st of June, Ieyasu passed into eternity, possibly due to stomach cancer. He had risen from a captive and a vassal of the Imagawa to become ruler of all Japan. He was leaving behind a strong legacy, and his descendants would rule the land of the rising sun for 2.5 centuries. For some historians, the siege of Osaka is considered the end of the Sengoku era. Indeed, Japan had entered a new chapter in its history, the Edo period, when the Tokugawa clan ruled over the land unobstructed. It is a period characterized by relative peace that brought prosperity to the people, especially during the first half. It is also a period synonymous with Japan's isolation from the outside world, the Sakoku. However, all that would come crushing down during the end years of the Tokugawa rule, a period known as Bakumetsu, when American ships forced open Japan's borders and brought forth a decade of great upheaval, which led to the violent collapse of the shogunate in the Boshin War. We are already working on the next series on Japanese history, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our patrons and YouTube members can watch more than 200 exclusive videos. Join their ranks via the link in the description or by pressing the join button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.